Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. A major tenet of electric universe theory is that electrical currents flowing through the conductive medium of plasma induce powerful magnetic fields at all scales throughout the cosmos. Electric universe Earth, the Norwegian experimentalist Christian Birkeland postulated more than a century ago that electrical current systems produce Earth's auroras, a thesis confirmed many decades ago. Quite recently, it's been discovered that so-called supersonic plasma jets reaching up to 10,000 degrees Celsius in Earth's upper atmosphere are associated with, quote, large electrical fields. Nevertheless, the existence of cosmic electrical currents mostly remains a taboo subject in the astronomical literature. In this episode, author Richard Moore explores from an electrical perspective two fundamental astronomical questions. Why do stars and planets have magnetic fields? And why do they rotate?
Why do stars and planets have magnetic fields and why do they rotate? And the Standard Model offers explanations, but if you're familiar with the EU model, then you have to realize those explanations just really don't make any sense. They're talking about imagined convection currents in a nuclear-powered sun and twisted magnetic field lines and, all those kinds of explanations which we know aren't valid. Well, I saw Don Scott's presentations on cosmic power lines, and he made clear in that is that the incoming Birkeland current determines the spacing of planetary orbits. He showed that with his Bessel functions. And what that's saying is that there's a massive magnetic field pervading the whole solar system coming in from the Birkeland current. And so I started wondering, what's the relationship between that massive magnetic field and the sun's magnetic field? Do they interfere with one another or what? So that's what got me started thinking, and that's where I came up with the hypothesis that I came up with. For those two questions, we'll start by looking at the sun's magnetic field. Now, most people would just naturally say that the magnetic field is internally generated, some kind of rotational dynamo or whatever. And that is what the Standard Model says. However, as I said before, their reasoning is all based on false assumptions. Same thing for the question of why does the sun's magnetic field reverse? I mean, if it is internally generated dynamo, then why would it reverse? Doesn't seem to make any sense. And again, they have a model. What they say is it has to do with twisted magnetic current. So I started wanting to think, well, what could the EU say about the sun's magnetic field? Is it an electromagnet? We've got these huge currents coming in at the north and south poles, and so maybe they're acting, sort of playing the same role as a solenoid, creating an electromagnet. Now, for those two questions, we'll start by looking at the sun's magnetic field. Let's look now at a Birkeland current coming in at the North Pole. We'll just take half of it for now. There's one at the South Pole as well. Try to think of the Birkeland current as if it were a solenoid. Now, the problem with that is that the Birkeland current is made up of concentric cylinders, and each cylinder tries to induce an opposite field. So it's even one Birkeland current on its own is rather complicated if you think of it as a solenoid. However, in Don Scott's talk, he showed us this first-order Bessel function, which gives us the strength of the current in each of the cylinders. And it's clear from that diagram that the central cylinder dominates. It's considerably more powerful than any of the other cylinders. And so to some extent, the other cylinders, you might say, cancel one another out, and it's really the central cylinder, to a first approximation, that is going to act as a solenoid on the sun. So what we have then is two central fields opposing one another to a first approximation. And each of them is trying to induce an opposite field because they're both looking at the pole they come in at, they're rotating clockwise, both of them. So that's opposite torques and opposite magnetic fields. So what the result is going to be, if we assume that one of those is going to be slightly larger than the other, then we can kind of do a vector addition of the two fields, and what we end up with is a smaller field with the same orientation as the larger of the two incoming fields. So that smaller field is then acting on the sun. And then the sun being, it's going to have a lot of iron in it, because stars are created in Z pinches, and that's where the heaviest ions are concentrated. So that field coming in from the Birkeland current, the net field of the two currents, is going to be amplified by the ferric sun, just the way when you put an iron rod in a solenoid, then suddenly you've got a strong magnetic field. Without the iron rod, you don't. So that explains why there's a magnetic field from an EU point of view. Now the question of why does the field reverse every 11 years? Well, that could simply be that the relative strength of the two incoming currents changes. So if the one at the north is stronger, then we get a net field that gets amplified by the sun. It has one polarity. But then if the one from the south becomes stronger, then the net polarity is going to reverse. So it's not really a mystery. We only need to just ask the question is there a shift in the relative strength of those two fields? And if there is, then that would explain the reversal of the magnetic field. So my conclusion from all of that is that the sun is an electromagnet, because that explains the source of the magnetic field and explains the reversal of the magnetic field. And all of these arguments with respect to the sun really apply to other stars, to planets, and to the Earth. So the hypothesis I'm putting on the table here is that all stars and planets are electromagnets. So then we come to our second question. Why do stars and planets rotate? Well, that net incoming current, that net incoming magnetic field, also exerts a net torque. But of course, the angular momentum of planets and stars is so tremendous, so large magnitude, that we probably would hardly even notice the effect of the torque of the current. Although someone made the point that there's a slight variation in the day that correlates with solar ejections, which would sort of be an indication that you can actually measure it on some small, tiny scale, the effect of the incoming torque. So the question then is, what's the source of the original rotation? So what we could look at there is, we've got an image of a stellar nursery. Now, what's happening in a stellar nursery is you've got all these Birkeland currents that are in glow mode, creating Z-pinches and creating stars and planets. Those are much stronger currents than our current sun is. We don't have any glow mode current coming into our sun. It's much less energetic once stars settle down. But when they're being created, you've got very strong fields, magnetic fields, and strong torque acting on these newly born celestial objects. So my hypothesis there is that stars and planets spin up as electric motors. So basically what I'm saying is that stars and planets act as electromagnets and as electric motors. So summarizing the hypotheses, first hypothesis, magnetic fields of stars and planets are induced by the incoming Birkeland currents. The second hypothesis, rotation of stars and planets is due to cumulative effect of torque from incoming Birkeland currents. So that's the story.
For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info.
We're Rhett and Link, and we wanted to show you how we created our amazing new website with Wix.
Now, we know that having a great website is crucial because
Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. For many decades, the standard cosmological model has stated that the universe began many billions of years ago with a primordial explosion called the Big Bang. Beginning from an unimaginably hot, dense point, material rushed outward at nearly the speed of light. And to this day, the physical expansion of the universe is thought to continue. When scientists found evidence for the apparent acceleration of the expansion rate of the universe, the hypothetical influence of dark energy was invented. For a scientific hypothesis to be testable, it must make predictions. And the technological data available to test the Big Bang hypothesis has never been finer. For over 5 years on this series, we have reported on numerous theory-shattering discoveries that challenge the very underpinnings of the Big Bang. From impossibly huge structures that exceed the size limits for any object at this time in the Big Bang universe, to so-called ancient stars, whose chemical composition is completely wrong if they formed from material in the early universe, to grand design galaxies that display a complexity of form that defy their theoretical age, to evidence that the so-called expansion of the universe is accelerating at an impossibly fast rate, even accounting for dark energy's influence. Many scientists have acknowledged the major problems these discoveries pose for Big Bang cosmology. Nevertheless, consensus scientific opinion remains that the Big Bang is the best current theory for the origins of our universe. Indeed, a recent Scientific American article aroused a response from some of the world's most revered cosmologists that demonstrates just how slow and difficult is real change in the culture of science. The article in question, entitled "Cosmic Inflation Theory Faces Challenges," proposed that the universe began with a so-called Big Bounce instead of a Big Bang. The authors question cosmologists' interpretations of measurements of the so-called cosmic microwave background. Specifically, they disagree with the interpretation that data first published in 2013 proves that an extremely fast inflation occurred after a Big Bang 13.7 billion years ago. They state, if anything, the Planck data disfavored the simplest inflation models and exacerbated long-standing foundational problems with the theory, providing new reasons to consider competing ideas about the origin and evolution of the universe. Yet even now, the cosmology community has not taken a cold, honest look at the Big Bang inflationary theory, or paid significant attention to critics who question whether inflation happened. In a response letter to the controversial article, 33 scientists, including physicist Stephen Hawking, begin with a statement: "There is no disputing the fact that inflation has become the dominant paradigm in cosmology." They then accuse the authors of, quote, dismissing the research of not only all the authors of this letter, but also that of a substantial contingent of the scientific community. However, the problems for Big Bang cosmology reach far beyond anything that Hawking and his colleagues seem ready to acknowledge. On the question of the so-called cosmic microwave background, or CMB, the conclusion that the radiation is a, quote, background at all begins with the assumption of a Big Bang. But as previously discussed on this series, ample evidence exists to consider that the, quote, asymmetric radiation isn't local origins of the radiation would also help explain the seemingly baffling discovery of apparently vast and remote cosmic voids. The appearance of a cold spot, where the, quote, temperature of an area of space is interpreted as significantly lower than the surrounding region, suggests the presence of a void where many galaxies should be observed. The interpretation of the size of the so-called void is based on the assumption that the redshift of the surrounding galaxies provides an accurate measure of the object's size and distance. In recent years, some scientists have offered the incredible speculation that such a void is actually the imprint of a parallel universe. In fact, the concept of parallel universes, or the multiverse, is a theory championed by the aforementioned Stephen Hawking, as well as Brian Greene, Michio Kaku, and the current host of the television show Cosmos, Neil deGrasse Tyson. Ironically, at the time that cosmologist Carl Sagan wrote his iconic book Cosmos, challenges to the very foundations of the Big Bang were still permitted. On the question of whether the Doppler interpretation of galactic redshift is a reliable indicator of an expanding universe, Sagan wrote, "There is nevertheless a nagging suspicion among some astronomers that all may not be right with the deduction from the redshift of galaxies via the Doppler effect that the universe is expanding. The astronomer Halton Arp has found enigmatic and disturbing cases where a galaxy and a quasar, or a pair of galaxies that are in apparent physical association have very different redshifts. Sagan continues, if ARP is right, the exotic mechanisms proposed to explain the energy source of distant quasars, supernova chain reactions, supermassive black holes and the like, would prove unnecessary. Quasars need not then be very distant, but some other exotic mechanism will be required to explain the redshift. In either case, something very strange is going on in the depths of space. At the other end of the spectrum from so-called vast cosmic voids are objects that appear impossibly huge. One such object, the quasar cluster Huge LQG, is supposedly so enormous it would comprise about 5% of the visible universe. As one astronomer said of the discovery, it, quote, upsets the foundation of everything we do. The force of gravity is weak and takes time to move things around. The elapsed time since the conjectured Big Bang sets a limit on how big any structure can be. Structures exceeding that limit are, by the cosmologists' own admission, impossible. One possible solution to this enigma is that the objects simply are not as distant and huge as they appear, based on their measured redshift. Halt and Arp proposed that the redshift of quasars depends not only on a velocity value, but also its, quote, intrinsic redshift. This would be a property of matter that is subject to change over time. Arp found that the intrinsic redshift of a quasar or galaxy took discrete values, which decreased with distance from a central active galaxy. In Arp's hypothesis, many mature galaxies of a specific type eject newborn objects, called QSOs, or quasars, and these objects grow up to be companion galaxies of their parents. As they move away from the parent, their mass and brilliance changes, their velocity slows, and they tend to begin to fall back toward the parent galaxy. Proponents of the electric universe, including physicist and chief science advisor to the Thunderbolts project, Wal Thornhill, agree with Arp's thesis of quasar ejection. However, Thornhill disagrees with Arp's description of the mass of quasars increasing with time. Arp proposed that the existence of a new quasar becomes recognized by matter and the rest of the universe at the speed of light. But in Thornhill's view, an initially positively charged quasar is followed by a beam of electrons from its parent galaxy, which would explain both a quantized redshift and increase in mass. These electrons may come in bursts, like the quasar ejections themselves, which, if true, would predict and explain seemingly impossibly sudden changes in quasars. As we reported last year in this series, many recently discovered objects in space lend great credence to this thesis. A team of astronomers using the Sloan Digital Sky Survey observed quasars behaving in a manner that completely upends conventional theory. Using images from the Pan-STARRS survey, the scientists identified 1,000 objects that appeared to vary in brightness over a period of just 10 years. Among these objects were a total of 5 galaxies that the team witnessed shape-shifting into quasars in a seemingly impossibly short period of time. The team also recorded a total of 12 quasars, quote, shutting down in a period of hundreds of days, rather than the hundreds of thousands of years required by standard theory. As reported by NewScientist.com, astronomers expect quasars to use up their fuel and settle down into quiet galaxies, a process that should take hundreds of thousands of years. So last year, when 12 quasars were spotted shutting down in just hundreds of days, it was a shock. In subsequent decades, as demonstrated by the recent protests of Hawking and company, little has changed in the culture of science. The seemingly endless cosmic surprises have yet to force any real reassessment of the cherished 13.5 billion year, quote, history of the universe. Institutional science remains unready to confront the possibility that based on our current limited knowledge, we must accept a universe of unknown age and extent. So the surprises for cosmologists will only continue, since nature seems to have no regard for human beliefs. For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info.
We're Rhett and Link, and we wanted to show you how we created our amazing new website with Wix.
Now, we know that having a great website is crucial because when we look good online, our brand just feels good.
Check out all these templates. There are hundreds of them.
And they're actually fully designed websites. I like.
Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. In his previous Space News interview, Thunderbolts contributor Andrew Hall offered his insights on a new model for lightning on Earth, based on the understanding that our planet's atmosphere is a giant electric circuit. While mainstream science certainly recognizes extraordinary electrical phenomena on Earth, the real cause of such phenomena remains hypothetical, with many remaining mysteries. In this episode, Hall further explores the new Electric Universe perspective on extreme earthly weather.
In a previous episode of Space News, we talked about nature's electrode, how a cold plasma corona is the proper electronic model for a lightning genesis, and how mechanisms for ionization in a thunderstorm work. Now let's take in the bigger picture to get a more coherent look at a thunderstorm. The proper electrical analogy for a supercell storm is a thermopile. Thermopile is an electrical circuit that you've probably seen in use. Ice cool.
Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. Scientists working at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory are proposing a radical new theory about the nature of invisible, theoretical dark matter particles. The scientists have developed what they call a, quote, stealth dark matter model, which suggests that dark matter is composed of electrically charged particles, and which are bound by a mysterious, unknown force. The theorists are hoping to use the Large Hadron Collider to try and verify their model. A recent Science news story describing this research states, dark matter is currently thought to be completely inert to electromagnetic radiation, so it would be remarkable to discover that it is in fact composed of electrically charged particles which have somehow managed to avoid detection. However, today in our discussion with physicist Eugene Bagashov, we take a step backwards to ask a more fundamental question. Why should anyone assume that dark matter actually exists?
First of all, we need to remember what was the actual reason for inventing dark matter in the first place and how the idea of it evolved in the last decades. The initial problem dates back to 1930s when astronomers like Jan Oort and Fritz Zwicky have discovered that there is something wrong with the motions of stars and other objects in galaxies. The problem was pretty simple. Newton's law states that the square of orbital velocity of an object should be proportional to the force that keeps it in its orbit. In gravitationally centered orbital mechanics, gravity is considered to be the only acting force, so here the velocity of a body should be proportional to the gravitating mass around which this body is revolving. Thus, the velocity of a star or molecular cloud or any other object that moves around the galactic center should be proportional to the mass of a galaxy itself. We're talking about the mass that lies inside the body's orbit. And the actual measurements of velocities made using Doppler effect have shown that they are too big. There is simply not enough mass on the other side of the equation. Mechanically speaking, the centrifugal force should have thrown these stars away long time ago with such orbital velocities, since there is not enough gravitational force to counteract it, to keep them in place. This became known as the galaxy rotation problem, or the missing mass problem. So to provide the necessary mass, Zwicky first proposed to take into account not only the luminous matter such as stars and nebulae, the mass of which we might estimate to at least some degree of reliability, but also various non-luminous stuff such as, I quote, cool and cold stars, macroscopic and microscopic solid bodies, and gases. It was in his articles that the term dark matter have appeared for the first time, at least to my knowledge. But as we can see, at least in this quote from 1937, it means just normal matter that simply doesn't shine so bright. Over the coming years, this idea that there should be some sort of invisible matter that might govern the behavior of normal observable matter grew stronger. It was further reinforced from the other side of the universe in terms of scale, and by that I mean the microworld and high-energy particle physics. Theoretical particle physics was in its bloom at that time, with more and more new particles discovered and theoretically proposed every year. So this way or another, it soon became a commonly shared idea that there might be some other, yet undiscovered invisible substance or a set of some unusual particles that correspond to dark matter. By the time when the new observations of galactic behavior were made by Vera Rubin, Kent Ford, and others in 60s and 70s, this idea was already anchored in many people's minds, and one might say that not much has changed ever since. It was generally accepted that the lack of force equals lack of mass, and the latter was accounted for by the action of some yet unknown particles or fields or other quantum objects. For example, it was proposed that supersymmetric particles might be the answer to the problem. Supersymmetry, or SUSY, is a theory that proposes that every particle species should have a partner particle species that is described by other quantum statistics. This means that there should be an undiscovered fermion paired with each known boson, and vice versa. There should be an undiscovered boson per each known fermion. It is worth noting that none of these partner particles were discovered since the inception of the theory in 1966 and wide recognition in the early 70s. In general, modern physics recognizes four fundamental interactions: gravitational, electromagnetic, weak, and strong. The range of the latter two is limited by the size of an atomic nucleus, so they cannot make any difference at astrophysical distances. So we are left only with gravitation and electromagnetism here. And once again, since it is generally supposed that there is no charge separation and there are no electric currents in space, there is only gravitation left. And we're back in the same mousetrap with missing masses and mysterious behavior in violation of Newton's law. By the way, since I mentioned fundamental interactions, in the second half of the 1980s, there also was a proposition that the so-called WIMPs, or weakly interacting massive particles, could be the main component of dark matter. So people tried to construct various types of dark matter particles, including the possibility for them to interact not only by means of gravity, but also through weak interaction. But again, that only gives us the ability to detect them when they hit our sensors, and it doesn't concern the ability to keep galaxies together, which is still considered to be due to gravitation. In this slide, one new article looks interesting. It states that, I quote, "Dark matter may be composed of electrically charged particles." This is an interesting step forward because an electric charge is, by definition, an ability to interact electromagnetically. So in this sense, if dark matter has an electric charge, it is no longer dark and we actually can see it, although it might not emit a lot. One might say that thus we return to the original interpretation of this term proposed by Zwicky. Of course, that doesn't mean that the authors state that it is the electricity that governs the behavior of galaxies, but we're one step closer to this idea here. In fact, the authors state that these charged particles might then combine to form electrically neutral particles, which they refer to as stealth dark matter. Thus they still keep to the standard gravitational scenario, ignoring the possible electromagnetic nature of galactic behavior. It seems like it would still take years for the scientific community to turn to plasma physics and electromagnetism as a significant part in this play. Although it should already be quite clear that instead of violating Occam's razor by inventing some 5 times more matter than there is, maybe it would be better to use the forces and interactions that we already are aware of with the matter that we can observe with reliability. With that being said, and for the sake of completeness, I also want to mention a couple of other options that are somewhat out of the field of mainstream science these days. In general, as I've already said, Newton's law contains not just gravitating mass, but a force, with this mass being only a part of the whole expression. The square of velocity should be proportional to the gravitational constant multiplied by mass around which the object is revolving, and inversely proportional to the distance between them. So if the velocity on the left side is too big, not only we can artificially enhance the mass through injection of dark matter, but we also can suppose that the gravitational constant is not constant. It might, for example, depend on masses or distances. So for big objects like galaxies, it would be different than in our solar system or on planet Earth. And we actually know that the gravitational constant is very hard to measure. Maybe that's because it is not actually constant. It also might be somehow governed by the electric forces, which is not far from the ideas of Walt Thornhill, if I'm not mistaken. There are also attempts in rewriting the Newton's law itself. For example, there is so-called modified Newtonian dynamics, or MOND, developed in 1983 by Mordechai Milgram. While being quite successful in explaining the behavior of galaxies, it still faces significant problems on a slightly bigger scale in galactic clusters. So in my opinion, the field of possibilities is quite broad here, and the idea of dark matter is not in any way more preferable than modifications of Newton's law or consideration of electromagnetic forces. The latter, however, may be somewhat more comfortable, since it doesn't require any adjustments to what is considered today as fundamental laws. We just have to discard the hypothesis of charge neutrality in space and consider the actual work of electricity across vast cosmic distances.
For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info.
If you write anything on your computer, you need to get Grammarly.
I write pretty much all day, every day, and Grammarly makes my writing better.
As a student, I like that it's free.
It actually is correcting everything as I'm writing it.
Grammar errors, spelling errors, and even helps me find the right words to use so I can say what I want to say.
It catches all those embarrassing little mistakes before I hit send.
I downloaded Grammarly around my freshman year because I was just horrible at typing.
Grammarly is like my secret weapon for writing papers.
It's the perfect tool for your resume. You don't want any errors when it's your first impression.
I use Grammarly for important emails, social media posts, which there are a lot of.
I've used every tool out there, and Grammarly is by far the best for improving your writing.
Grammarly is making me a better writer, and it's free.
I would recommend Grammarly if you're a student,
my family,
my peers, my colleagues.
It's like having your own personal proofreader for free.
Download Grammarly for free at Grammarly.com.
Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. Today, we begin a series of reports that will discuss the latest scientific papers on the European Space Agency's Rosetta mission to Comet 67P. In addition to countless unresolved puzzles facing comet scientists, we have discussed in previous episodes the problem of the comet's double-lobed shape. However, that particular form of a comet nucleus is apparently not unique. Several other of the comets imaged to date have displayed similar forms. Multiple asteroids, including this one imaged on July 25th of this year, have displayed distinct peanut-like shapes, with a marked narrowing at the body's neck. And recently, NASA's New Horizons mission has revealed that the Plutonian moon Hydra also has a double-lobed form. Why do so many of these different types of bodies in the solar system display this particular shape? The electric universe theory states that comets and asteroids were electrically excavated from planets and moons in a relatively recent epoch of planetary instability. As discussed in previous episodes, plasma scientist Dr. C.J. Ransom produced these familiar double-lobed forms in experiments with electrical discharges to samples of hematite. In fact, Comet 67P has revealed countless distinctly planetary features, including wind-streaked rocks, fields of boulders and rubble, mountainous terrain that appears to have been uplifted from a planetary body, and even sand dunes.
However, as Wal Thornhill explains, the only explanation that Rosetta scientists can offer for the comet's shape is a remarkably improbable low-velocity collision between two comets.
A report by the European Space Agency published on 28 September titled How Rosetta's Comet Got Its Shape concluded from some important research published in the journal Nature the same day that two comets collided at low speed in the early solar system to give rise to the distinctive rubber duck shape of Comet 67P Churyumov-Gerasimenko. Earlier, there were two competing ideas. Did two comets merge, or did localized erosion of a single object form the neck? Now, scientists have an unambiguous answer to the conundrum. They have shown that the shape arose from a low-speed collision between two fully fledged, separately formed comets. Matteo Massaroni, lead author from the University of Padua, Italy, and an associate scientist of the OSIRIS team, said, "It is clear from the images that both lobes have an outer envelope of material organized in distinct layers, and we think these extend for several hundred meters below the surface. This points to the layered envelopes in the comet's head and body forming independently before the two objects merged later," concludes Matteo. It must have been a low-speed collision in order to preserve such ordered strata to the depths our data imply. Co-author Bjorn Davidson added, "In addition, the striking structural similarities between the two lobes imply that despite their initial independent origins, they must have formed through a similar accretion process. Layering has also been observed on the surface of other comets during previous flyby missions, suggesting that they also underwent a similar formation history." Holger Sierks, OSIRIS principal investigator at the Max Planck Institute for Solar System Research in Göttingen, said, "How the comet got its curious shape has been a major question since we first saw it. Now, thanks to this detailed study, we can say with certainty that it is a contact binary." So much for the reports. But how exactly do you get two widely separated bodies experiencing similar primordial stratified accretion? And why primordial? That's simply an assumption. And the mechanism of gravitational accretion has never been shown to work. Notice also the emphasis on gentle and low-speed collisions. Just how slow does it have to be so the result is not mutual fragmentation and dispersal? And how does a collision form a neck between the two lobes? On top of that, what are the chances of collision of two tiny bodies of a few kilometres cross-section in a volume of space in the outer solar system that is unimaginably huge? The explanation requires so many post hoc and unlikely conditions that it is unbelievable. It only passes the critical faculties because it's a story that has been repeated and repeated until we no longer think about it. The Nature paper refers to the stratified rocky-like material seen on the comet's surface. It shows how experts can become blind to what the untrained eye can plainly see, that Comet 67P is rocky. The selective blindness occurs because it destroys a cherished belief in the centuries-old story of the primordial solar system. But that story has failed repeatedly. It is not predictive. Each new discovery is a surprise, the most recent being Pluto and its moon. And now that we have information from more than 2,000 exoplanetary systems, our solar system seems like the odd one out. But modern specialization and fragmentation of science allows such disconnects to exist and spread, which must lead to an inevitable crisis. The history of science shows this to be the case, with centuries of stagnation followed by sudden breakthroughs, and often the breakthroughs have come from outsiders who look at problems with a beginner's mind. Old beliefs die hard. The astronomer, the late Tom Van Flandern, in his 1993 book Dark Matter, Missing Planets and New Comets, made the comparison between comets, minor planets and asteroids and suggested they are the same basic types of rocky bodies. Comets are dark, reflecting a few % of sunlight, which is not expected for icy bodies. And radar echoes from Comet Encke implied a non-porous, probably rock, surface material. An expert in celestial mechanics, Van Flandern is perhaps best known for his exploding planet hypothesis, which he proposed as the origin of asteroids and comets, and which he supported by showing that the orbits of comets and asteroids could be understood in terms of an origin in a late explosive event in the asteroid belt. His exploding planet hypothesis is discounted, of course, by the lack of a plausible mechanism to cause a planet to explode, and now by the onion skin layering in the two lobes of Comet 67P, which implies formation by accretion rather than fragmentation in an explosion. But his arguments are compelling for a cataclysmic event in the asteroid belt that produced tens of thousands of asteroids and comets. What's most persuasive is that his unusual hypothesis predicted stable asteroid satellites, which was surprisingly confirmed. So what was the explosive event, and how did it form peanut-shaped comets and asteroids? The chances of direct collisions of tiny rocks in the vastness of interplanetary space to produce the peanut shape are negligible. Multiply that by the odds of the colliding rocks sticking together and forming a neck, and the chances are about zero. Gravitational capture and tidal forces do not enhance the odds significantly. The serious nature of this problem was highlighted in July this year when Lance Benner, who leads NASA's asteroid radar research program, said that radar imaging has shown that about 15% of near-Earth asteroids larger than 600 feet, or 180 metres, have this sort of lobed peanut shape. There must be a process that forms the double-lobed shape naturally. A clue comes from experiments done by C.J. Ransom using an electric discharge striking hematite powder to simulate the red Martian surface. The Martian blueberries were replicated in colour and shape by C.J. Ransom using an electric discharge striking that interlocking blueberries are a property of spherules formed during an electric discharge. It may also be significant considering the apparent low density of Comet 67P that the hematite spherules were hollow with thick formed during an electric discharge. It seems that the catastrophic event required by Van Flammen's research was of an electrical nature. There is a cosmic electric discharge, an interplanetary thunderbolt, which has been graphically depicted many times in our space news. Van Flandern, an expert in orbital dynamics, traced his exploding planet event to the asteroid belt, beyond Mars. So it is highly significant that Mars was identified with the cosmic thunderbolt and was reported to have received a scar planet event to the asteroid belt beyond Mars, following a battle using this. So it is highly significant that Mars was identified with the cosmic thunderbolt and was reported to have received a stretches a third of the way around Mars. Is that scar? Almost 4 billion cubic kilometres of rock and dust was excavated from Mars within the memory of mankind. A great deal of it accelerated into space by a gigantic plasma arc. Meteorites from Mars are still arriving on Earth today. And in 1988 I published a paper arguing that of 17 mysteries associated with common meteorites, a plasma arc process could explain all of them. The discharge attracts and heats matter along the discharge axis. Repeated lightning strokes along the same path will produce layering of matter accreted along that discharge axis. The appearance of that discharge could be likened to bead lightning, a string of glowing rocky beads. Matter is also accelerated along the axis, giving a high probability of forming lobed asteroid and comet precursors. The spatially and temporally confined nature of this process is also ideal for forming stable asteroid and comet satellites. So when Rosetta project scientist Matt Taylor says of Comet 67P, "This result adds to our growing knowledge of the comet, how it formed and its evolution," he is dead wrong. The accepted story of the slow formation and evolution of the solar system over billions of years is fictional. The story I have told here is one of chaos and violence in the solar system within the last 10,000 years or so. As one philosopher has written, Newton, on consciously religious rather than scientific grounds, gave currency to a new form of the old belief that the celestial order is altogether superior to the terrestrial, and cannot in particular be the scene of any catastrophic change. That belief has not changed much in 350 years.
It's appalling that, in the 21st century, there is still so little...
Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. In part 2 of this presentation, physicist Wal Thornhill continues his discussion of some of the foundational theories of modern physics and cosmology. As Thornhill explains, the aesthetics of mathematical theories may often have little or no relationship to physical reality.
In July this year, the journal Nature published a book review by astronomer Joseph Silk titled The Impulse of Beauty, which highlights the age-old problem of the tendency to mathematical mysticism in science, a trait that blossomed with Einstein in the 20th century. The book is by physicist and Nobel laureate Frank Wilczek and is titled A Beautiful Question. It asks, can beautiful ideas drive science? The short answer is yes, they can. But science should never be a subjective beauty contest amongst mathematicians. The book review is a lesson by two distinguished artists from the postmodern school of physics in how not to do science. Silk writes, the greatest scientists from Galileo to Albert Einstein saw in physics almost infinite beauty, including symmetry, harmony and truth. Here we see some subtle propaganda, since both Galileo and Einstein were mathematicians, and the almost infinite beauty, whatever that is, may be imagined in pure mathematics. But what relevance does it have to the messy real world of experimental physics? Infinity itself is an unreal concept that leads mathematicians astray. Silk goes on. Wilczek lays out a vision of truth and beauty inspired by great modern physicists and classical philosophers such as Pythagoras and Plato. Both Pythagoras and Plato were mystical geometricians. Einstein followed that tradition with his mystical curved space, which was supposed to explain gravity. But geometry describes, it doesn't explain the physics. Space is the concept of location in 3 dimensions. It's not some thing that can be curved. Einstein gave no physical explanation why his imaginary curved space should have any effect on a body, or vice versa. The 3-dimensional image beloved of virtual reality science programs show a planet on a rubber sheet deformed by the weight of the sun. We imagine the planet being forced to roll toward the sun, but there's no reason for the planet to move anywhere. Empty space exerts no force, and the imagery is devious because it uses gravity, the weight of the sun, to explain gravity. The concept of mathematical beauty and symmetry plays a dominant role in physics today and is responsible for the billions spent on the Large Hadron Collider. The results have not confirmed theoretical expectations. Incredibly, the experiment is all about mass and energy, while both concepts have no definition in terms of the structure and behavior of matter. Mass is simply defined as the amount of matter, which is nonsense because mass is an energetic variable according to E=mc squared. But then energy is blandly defined as the ability to do work, but it is matter with energy that does the work. It's no wonder the Large Hadron Collider is a waste of money. Einstein's first postulate of special relativity is concerned almost entirely with physical processes observed from reference frames moving at constant velocities with respect to each other, so-called inertial frames of reference in relative motion. However, relative motion produces the controversial clock or twin paradox. The physicist Tom Phipps shows there is no real paradox. Which of two clocks runs slower depends on which has been moved, yet relative motion of the clocks does not depend on which has been moved. The paradox results from Einstein's obviously invalid postulate that the inertial frames are symmetrical. In the real universe, where the gravitational force connects all matter in real time, the inertial frames are asymmetric. The clock that is moving fastest with respect to the fixed stars has more energy than that of a slower clock. So, according to E=mc squared, the masses of all subatomic particles in the moving clock will increase and slow the atomic clock rate. Time does not dilate for the moving clock. The clock simply counts fewer ticks in universal time. This interpretation is verified by the Global Positioning System, which uses orbiting clocks that have their slower clock rates adjusted by counting fewer oscillations per tick before the launch, so that when in orbit they tick at the rate of the faster ground clocks. Note that a ground clock never runs slower than an orbiting clock, nor does it appear to run slower. There is no Einstein or Lorentz relativistic symmetry. So the claim that the GPS system validates the relativist's position defies logic and real-world implementation. Tom Phipps writes, "What is left of relativity modestly shrinks from a world-defining revelation to a mere, almost insignificant, science of high-speed motions. The attendant simplification of theoretical physics is obvious, and that is the real beauty of physics, when simple fundamental concepts can explain the complexity and wonders of the universe."
For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info.
If you write anything on your computer, you need to get Grammarly.
I write pretty much all day, every day, and Grammarly makes my writing better.
As a student, I like that it's free.
It actually is correcting everything as I'm writing it.
Grammar errors, spelling errors, and even helps me find the right words to use so I can say what I want to say.
It catches all those embarrassing little mistakes before I hit send.
I downloaded Grammarly around my freshman year because I was just horrible at typing.
Grammarly is like my secret weapon.
Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. A new scientific experiment has reportedly confirmed one of the most startling concepts in quantum theory, so-called spooky action at a distance, or the discovery that simply measuring one object appears to affect another far-away object. Today, physicist Wal Thornhill begins the first of a two-part discussion on the significance of this discovery for modern physics and for the electric universe theory.
20th century physics has not lived up to its initial promise of producing a coherent view of the physical universe. Perhaps that's because we seem incapable of learning from history. Idolizing individuals and teaching their ideas dogmatically inhibits science. Declaring a person a genius is highly subjective and often politically and culturally determined. The story of Einstein and Eddington during and after the First World War sets the context as an escape from the madness of modern warfare by appealing to mathematical mysticism. Einstein in 1921 was the only scientist ever honoured with a ticker tape parade in New York, yet practically no one understood him or his theories of relativity. Those few who claimed to do so basked in his reflected glory and have done so ever since, despite Einstein's relativity making no real sense. It's an example of what Charles Mackay wrote in 1852 in his Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. Men, it has been well said, think in herds. It will be seen that they go mad in herds, while they only recover their senses slowly and one by one. The process of recovery has begun here and there, but it has to overcome the titanic inertia of global science institutions and the mass media. However, recent quantum experiments may speed things up by sharpening the focus on the incompatibility of relativity and quantum theory. A bad day for Albert Einstein was reported in Nature News on August the 27th. The most rigorous test of quantum theory ever carried out has confirmed that the spooky action at a distance that the German physicist famously hated, in which manipulating one object instantaneously seems to affect another far-away one, is an inherent part of the quantum world. Of course, Einstein hated the thought because it demonstrates that matter interactions at a distance can occur instantaneously. Forget relativity. Time is universal. Clock ticks are not. How many bad days must Einstein have before dogmatic belief in his work may be cross-examined? We are told that all experiments prove his theories, but that is a matter of interpretation of the experiments using a single idea. The big advances in science come with competing ideas. Of course, it appears to give the right answers, but if the interpretation requires rubbery measuring sticks and clocks, we must question whether we are still doing physics, which relies on standards of length and time. And appearances can be deceptive when Einstein's reference standard, the speed of light, is forced to be a constant by defining our standard of length in terms of the speed of light. There's a fundamental issue here for quantum theorists as well. They assume that their work refers only to the realm of subatomic particles because it deals with mathematical probabilities rather than cause and effect. In other words, it isn't physics, as evidenced by the use of weasel words like spooky and non-locality to tip the hat to Einstein's artificial speed limit. Meanwhile, the evidence for spooky action at a distance on a cosmic scale pokes astronomers in the eye. Newton was right. The planets orbit the sun where it is at that instant and not where the sun appears in the sky minutes or hours later. The astronomer Tom Van Flandern found empirically the speed of gravity to be in excess of 20
I don't know, did you guys see that flat earth argument?
Gravity is instantaneous.
I had with Anthony, what's his name, Riley, on Nathan Oakley's channel. Well, kind of a bunch of us had, but then I just really drove the screws on him.
There was no chance that Einstein would ever explain electromagnetic.
If not, you might want to see it. It's pretty hilarious.
Based on the quantum behavior of light. Perhaps he realized that when he argued strongly that quantum theory was incomplete because it was based on probabilities. The real physics of gravity will only come with a real physical understanding of subatomic particles and their instantaneous quantum interactions. That has been the aim of the electric universe. Only when the correct physical concepts are in place will mathematical theory become useful.
For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info.
Girls are fighting back every day. No two are the same. I wanna be like most girls. I wanna be like.
Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info.
Is my mic low?
At this point, we are a few weeks past the passing of Michael Steinbacher, and a lot of folks know I got very close to him. And
Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info.
Today, Wal Thornhill concludes his initial reports on the New Horizons mission to the dwarf planet Pluto.
Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info.
The Electric Universe community consists of individuals who seem to share a common trait. That is the tendency to question ideas and beliefs that academia and society at large accept as true. It's easy to recognize the obstinacy or closed-mindedness of others, but do we recognize these tendencies in ourselves? Today, Thunderbolt's colleague Chris Reeve discusses the lifelong challenge that human beings face, both individually and collectively, to develop the necessary skills and means to determine what is true.
Although we don't normally experience it, people deal with fear and anxiety at every moment of our lives. Fear that the earth might become uninhabitable, fear of war, fears about our family, and fear that we might lose our job. However, we don't feel these fears a lot of times because we've created effective, largely subconscious anxiety management systems. These subconscious systems provide us much comfort and room for more complex thought, insofar as they tirelessly work towards keeping us alive and out of harm's way. But they can also form a hidden barrier to the desire to adaptively change to our surroundings. The development of a more complex mental framework, a self-transforming mindset, can help the individual to recognize the filtering effect and limitations of his or her own frame of reference. The late philosopher Stephen Tolman once said, "A man demonstrates his rationality not by a commitment to fixed ideas, stereotyped procedures, or immutable concepts, but by the manner in which and the occasions in which he changes those ideas, procedures, and concepts." Quoting Kierkegaard, he added, "Concepts, like individuals, have their histories and are just as incapable of withstanding the ravages of time as are individuals." I want to talk in this video about the psychology of change, and my intention is to show that changes to society's scientific worldview reflect in some key ways the process of change that occurs at the level of the individual. Both possess this inherent resistance to change, which some psychologists have likened to an immune system. Understanding how this immunity to new ideas works at both the individual and societal levels is a necessary prerequisite for any attempt to deeply understand how people engage scientific controversies. Most people who follow this business of change in the sciences will tend to point to the work of Thomas Kuhn, whose ideas are just as relevant today as they were when he said them in the 60s. I want to talk about his work, but I want to first diverge from the traditional treatment of this subject by also mixing in the more recent work of two Harvard psychologists, Robert Kegan and Lisa Laskow-Lahey, authors of the book Immunity to Change: How to Overcome It and Unlock the Potential in Yourself and Your Organization. Although Kegan and Lahey wrote Immunity to Change to help individuals and businesses, their framework is also an unintentional commentary on the role of worldviews in scientific discourse. There are some important fundamental takeaways from Kegan and Lahey which we can put to use towards improving scientific discourse. I want to run through some quotes from their book to demonstrate them. Quote, "Many, if not most, of the change challenges you face today and will face tomorrow require something more than incorporating new technical skills into your current mindset. These are the adaptive challenges, and they can only be met by transforming your mindset, by advancing to a more sophisticated stage of mental development." Heifetz said, "The biggest error leaders make is when they apply technical means to solve adaptive challenges." The mere existence of an immune system, which protects us but also precludes change, suggests that our tendency in the face of some challenge will be to seek out technical solutions, which abide by our pre-existing worldview. In certain circumstances, this system of immunity can actually block our ability to implement changes which we actually desperately desire. Note the interesting similarity in approach to ad hoc modeling, this increasingly common modeling technique which seeks to fit scientific theory to observations through tweaks to the prior underperforming model. As I read these quotes about our personal immune systems, think about how they might apply also to the larger scientific community as well. Change does not fail to occur because of insincerity. The heart patient is not insincere about his wish to keep living, even as he reaches for another cigarette. Change fails to occur because we mean both things. It fails to occur because we are a living contradiction. When we make a New Year's resolution, we look at the behaviors we seek to extinguish as bad. We look at the behaviors we want to amplify as good. But until we understand the commitments that make the obstructed behaviors at the same time brilliantly effective, we haven't correctly formulated the problem. We have learned something that may be very hard for successful, capable people to believe. More than we understand, most people deal constantly with fear. I'm not afraid. You know you are saying to yourself right now, I feel fine. And you are right. You do not feel your fear. The reason you do not is because you are dealing with it. Though you are not aware of it, you have created a very effective anxiety management system, and that system is what we call the immunity to change. But we run these systems, even highly successful anxiety management systems, at a cost. Inevitably, they create blind spots, prevent new learning, and constantly constrain action in some aspects of our living. These costs show up when we are unable to deliver on some genuinely desired change. the realization of which would bring us to a new, higher level of functioning in ways we truly want to attain. Most self-improvement efforts take place in too constricted a psychological space, blind to these bigger dynamics at play. However hard they work, however sincerely they seek to extinguish their obstructive behaviors, everything will go on within the existing mindset. No new learning can occur. When I read this book, I was just stunned by the applicability of these ideas to the world of scientific research, science education, and scientific discourse. Keegan and Leahy are not just describing the challenge of change within a personal context, which is their intended focus. Their analysis also applies just as well to the challenge of change in scientific theory. If they are right that leaders will tend to mistake adaptive change challenges for technical challenges, then this mistake should be written all over our worst performing scientific theories. In scientists' attempts to solve a stubborn problem, we should expect to see our most brilliant leaders applying the most sophisticated tools available to them, but restricted to the context of the accepted scientific framework. Reframing to an alternative framework would predictably reduce the available toolset, but it should not be surprising if it also offers far simpler solutions. These less technical solutions should not be judged inferior simply because they are less technical. Listen to Keegan and Leahy explain the immune system metaphor. We use the medical metaphor of immunity quite mindfully to signify that, first of all, this phenomenon is not in itself a bad thing. On the contrary, an immune system is, most of the time, a beautiful thing, an extraordinarily intelligent force that elegantly acts to protect us, to save our lives. However, in some instances, an immune system can threaten our continued good health. When it rejects new material, internal or external to the body, that the body needs to heal itself or to thrive, the immune system can put us in danger. In these instances, the immune system is no less focused on protecting us, it is just making a mistake. It does not understand that it must alter its code. It does not understand that, ironically, in working to protect us, it is actually putting us at serious risk. And this brings us to the second significant implication of Keegan and Leahy's work. Keegan and Leahy's solution to the problem, the way to achieve change, transcends all contexts. It is to seek to transform our subject-object relationships. Where we are currently subject to a mindset, we must learn to look at that mindset as an object. If that sounds confusing, just follow along and it will become clear. If necessary, pause the video and study the diagram on the screen. Keegan and Leahy state, the root of any way of knowing, what philosophers call in epistemology, is an abstract sounding thing called the subject-object relationship. Any way of knowing can be described with respect to that which it can look at, the object, and that which it looks through, the filter or lens to which it is subject. Young children, for example, are still subject to their perceptions. So when something looks small to them, like cars and people viewed from atop a tall building, they think it actually is small. 3, 4, and 5-year-olds will look down and say, look at the tiny people. Children of 8, 9, and 10 can look at their perceptions. They will say, look how tiny the people look. A way of knowing becomes more complex when it is able to look at what before it could only look through. In other words, our way of knowing becomes more complex when we create a bigger system that incorporates and expands on our previous system. This means that if we want to increase mental complexity, we need to move aspects of our meaning making from subject to object, to alter our mindset so that we have a way of knowing or making meaning becomes a kind of tool that we have and can control or use, rather than something that has us and therefore controls and uses us. Now, within that context, let's talk about Thomas Kuhn. Kuhn was famous for claiming that science is characterized more by the paradigms employed by scientists than by their methods of inquiry.
Making things simple.
What he seems to be arguing is that the scientific community is subject to certain fundamental ideas. Kuhn characterized the history of science as exhibiting two fundamentally distinct scientific activities, one which he calls puzzle solving or normal science, describes the majority of scientific work, conducting experiments, making observations, applying mathematical models. The second, much less common scientific activity is that of revolutionary science. This is the creation of new scientific paradigms. Many people are already familiar with Kuhn's basic claims, but perhaps fewer are aware of philosopher Tolman's interesting addition. He rebutted that paradigm change can occur during normal science too, through many minor conceptual shifts. Quote, in the evolution of concepts, as in biological evolution, Tolman argues, changes occur in populations. Novel concepts come and go, but they influence thinking in a given discipline only when conditions are favorable. Only when the new concepts have advantages can they displace others. Joseph Novak is an education theorist and the creator of the concept map approach to science education. He points to Tolman's claim that new ideas must find a niche in order to survive. What I would add to this is a warning to avoid constraining this notion of paradigm change to just conceptual bridges. I've over the years witnessed this conversation about what a paradigm shift towards electrical cosmology might look like. What I've observed is that these conversations almost always ignore the role of our system of communication in facilitating such changes. Yet these communication systems were never intended to service this goal of empowering and elaborating the most novel scientific ideas.
Boy, I love making things simple rather than complicated. Love it. Let's go over one fact that is undeniable. Every branch of science or so-called science throughout history has done one thing consistently. Always and in all ways. They've always thought that their crap is accurate. Every single branch of physics, today, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200, 300, it's all the same. They've all thought their crap was accurate, and they've always been proven wrong. Absolutely every time. Do you think anybody understands what magnetism is or how a magnet works? Nope. Well, one person does. I do. I've spent many, many years on it, and I've finally figured it out, and it's irrefutable. I'll stake my life on it, and I'll debate it in front of anybody on the face of this planet. How does modern general relativity and quantum mechanics explain magnetism? Well, let's quote Richard Feynman. He's got a very famous video where he sits and squirms and wiggles and squirms in his chair. Like you've asked him, how many skeletons he's got in his basement. And he says, well, it's too complicated for me to explain to you. However, he does explain it. He actually doesn't explain it. In his book, QED, Strange Theory of Light and Matter. And the current scientific explanation for instantaneous action at a distance, i.e. magnetism, i.e. how a field operates, is virtual particles. Well, what's a virtual particle? Well, they don't exist. They're not the inputs or outputs of any experimentation, and they themselves will admit, quote-unquote, virtual particles are created to balance out equations. Why? That's no different than saying unicorns are leprechauns, or that which mediates fields and magnetism. It's ridiculous. They've also reified space. Let's quote Nikola Tesla on Einstein. Einstein is a beggar wrapped in purple robes whom ignorant folks take for the king. The theory that he said, these theories are wrapped in errors and fallacies, like clothes in a magnificent mathematical garb which fascinates, dazzles, and makes people blind to the underlying errors. This theory of relativity is like a beggar in purple clothes who the ignorant people take for a king. To say that in the presence of large bodies, space becomes curved is equivalent to stating that something can act upon nothing. Since action and reaction are coexistence, it follows that the supposed curvature of space, a la Einstein, is absolutely impossible. He goes on and on. He says of the theory of relativity, it's a mass of errors and deceptive ideas violently opposed to the great teaching of men of science of the past and even to common sense. Too bad, Sir Isaac, this is a poem that Tesla wrote. Too bad, Sir Isaac Newton, they dimmed your renown and turned your great science upside down. Now a long-haired crank, Einstein by name, put your high teachings to blame. He says that matter and force are transmutable, and wrong are the laws that you taught. I am much too ignorant, my son, for grasping at such crazy schemes so finely spun. My conclusions differ from Einstein's to the extent that they disprove Einstein's theory. My explanations of natural phenomena are not so involved as his. They are simpler, and when I'm ready to make a full announcement, it will be seen that I have proven my conclusions. I want to talk about the two things really quickly that scares the living piss. All you have to do is run across the best minds in general relativity, quantum mechanics, and all you have to do is ask them about two things. And they will stutter and piss themselves and scratch their ass and stammer, or they'll give you some sort of BS response to dazzle you, like throwing glitter in your eyeballs. Just ask them what one or two things are. Ask them to denote them, in other words, define them. They cannot. They never will. Instantaneous action at a distance and the word field, or in Greek, koros. They can't do it. Why? Because quantum mechanics and general relativity is nothing different than ancient Greek atomism. The premise is that the entire universe is a bunch of rolling microscopic BBs, most of which are invisible, and it's just like a rain stick. There's nothing but a bunch of rolling particles around, subatomic and otherwise, and everything is mediated by particles. But they know that's not true ultimately, because they know that fields are particle-free, and that if things are particles in instantaneous action at a distance, which we know does occur, obviously, has nothing to do with particles. Because obviously they'll be traveling faster than light, and according to GR and QM, nothing can travel faster than light. Oh, well, they've got a magical unicorn explanation for that. They got time-traveling particles and all. Their premise is that Mother Nature is an insane crack whore. Okay? That is the premise, irreducibly so, that quantum mechanics and general relativity forward, is that Mother Nature is an insane crack whore. They have absolutely no empirical data to prove anything regarding general relativity or quantum mechanics as regards the denotation or even the connotation of the word field. They cannot denote the word field. It is impossible for them. Nobody has ever defined field. I'm actually working on the book for the term field. It's just so simplex. So let's look at their explanation. In physics, a field is a physical quantity. It is? No, it isn't. There's no physicality to field. There's no physicality to magnetism. That's nonsense. That has a value for every point in space and time. Space and time are not points. Space and time. Time is a qualifier of the movement between bodies. Time is a qualifier, a post-attributional quality of space. And space itself, by the way, there are no fields that terminate in space. Space cannot be a terminus for anything. Space is neither a field nor a force. It, just as Tesla said, can act on Tesla didn't say these exact words, they're my words. Space can act on nothing and it does nothing. It has no attributes. That does quote Tesla, however. For example, on a weather map, a surface velocity is described as a vector on a map. Each vector represents a field or movement at that point. An electric field can be thought of as a condition in space. Space can have no conditions. Space is the attributional after effect of the loss of inertia. I'll show it to you really simple here in a second. It's just so simple. You've got two premises. You can believe general relativity and quantum mechanics, for which they have no empirical evidence whatsoever, or you can understand that Mother Nature, just to use the term loosely, is extremely simplex and divine. As I said, every branch of science has never deferred from the fact that they've always thought that their crap was right, and every time, they've always been proven wrong. You want to know the other big secret of general relativity? The one word that they hate the most. Now, they can never define instantaneous action at a distance or field. Never. Never. Never, never, never. But the one word that they hate most and yet still use is this one, ether. The Michelson-Morley experiment never disproved ether, by the way. Never. Absolutely. General relativity and quantum mechanics still use this, but they are unable to use this. This is like some stupid redneck from the 30s coming into the future and throwing around the N-word. In general relativity and quantum mechanics, this is like some stupid redneck blurting out the N-word. Okay, just pure and simple as an analogy. You use the word ether amongst these mental midget scumbags of pseudoscience and their virtual particles. You say ether, everybody turns their head around and goes, what? Yet they still use this. All they've done is renamed it. You know what they're calling it now? There's a few different things they're calling it. The favorite phrase now, because they know that fields and instantaneous action and distance have nothing to do with particles. And of course they will admit that 70% of the universe is a big unknown to them, yet they've still particularized it by calling it DM, dark matter. Matter, i.e. particles. Well, we don't know what it is, we're just calling it dark matter. We don't know what it is, well, that's what we're going to call it. But here's what they call the ether now. Because they know that none of their models can work without the ether, but they can't use the word ether. Because that is the giant, excuse my analogy, the giant N-word. You know, it's just like, oh my God, you didn't say that word, did you? No, I don't use that word. I'm just using it analogously, okay? They're calling it this. This is what the assholes of general relativity have replaced for the word ether. Quantum fluid. That's the new magic term for ether. You can't say ether anymore, so we're going to say quantum fluid. Quantum. This is nothing other than a cover word for ether. Instantaneous action and fields are particle free. There are no particles in a field. Even the morons of general relativity and quantum mechanics know this for a fact. They're idiots. Just huge, demented scumbag. They have denoted magnetism as being mediated up by virtual particles. There is no quantitative difference between saying virtual particles, which have never been observable outputs or inputs of any experiment. It is a total phantasm created in the minds of these atomistic idiots. It doesn't exist. There's no difference between saying that and unicorns and leprechauns are what causes and mediates and controls. There's no difference. No quantitative difference whatsoever. They'll go on to say, well, a field can be classified as a scalar field of... There is never an explanation from anybody. The way you scare the piss knot out of anybody that thinks that they understand science, a la field theory, is just to ask them about instantaneous action at a distance and ask them to define the word field. Say, since fields are particle free, define the word field. They won't. They'll say, well, field is like a region of an influence of what? Space. Well, space is neither a force. Okay? It can't act on anything. Space is neither a force nor a field. It can't act on anything. You can't reify one with the other. It doesn't work. It's absolutely impossible. By the way, what's the easiest way to describe what the earliest AC generators were? Here we have a magnet. Doesn't matter which pole it is. Here we have the DIP, the dielectric inertial plane. We have magnetic reciprocation north to south. We obviously have a necessitated rarefaction and compression. Dielectric inertial plane is in the middle. You know what a dielectric reflector is? Well, it's a copper coil. So what's an AC generator in essence? The most simplex variety. With a spinning magnet in the center, and we have a coil here. Let's just call this a one-phase coil. What's the simplest explanation of what an AC motor is in its earliest variety? It is nothing other than an inverted magnet. Here we have the centrifugal divergent magnetism moving in space and time, which necessitates phase induction of the dielectric inertial plane. Remember, copper, any sort of coil, is a dielectric reflector, okay? So here you have an inverse magnet. Here we have the dielectric inertial plane and a natural magnet in the center. Over here we have the dielectric inertial plane on the outside. Here we have the reciprocating magnetism, i.e. the force and motion. We have force and motion going on in the magnet, but it's also varied in respect to time, because we know that an AC generator, we're spinning the magnet inside the copper coil. This is a really simplex AC generator, okay? Real simplex power generator. Okay, and here we have the dielectric reflector, copper coil. The only thing an AC motor is versus a magnet is an inverted magnet, an inside-out magnet. It is that simple. Oh my God, I wish someone told me this 20 years ago. What is an AC motor? Why, it's an inside-out magnet. All you have to do is vary the reciprocating phased centrifugal divergent magnetism with respect to time. Just hook a drive shaft right here, hook it up to turning water or, you know, wind, whatever. Vary it with respect to time, closely against the dielectric reflector, i.e. a copper coil, and you have power generation. Okay? That's simple. Now I could tell you something about what you could do to magnets using compression, but that's for another video. Anyway, check for part 2. I'm going to talk about inertia versus force and motion. Catch you then. Oh my God, Mother Nature is so simple. I made a lot of videos on the denotation of what the term polarized is. By the way, there are 2 ways to draw a line. There's no such thing as a point or a line. There's only such thing as a point line. This is how a human draws a line, okay? Obviously so. This is how Mother Nature draws a line. Oh my God, that makes so much sense. Here we have counter space. Over here we have space, the creation of space. But over we have F and M, force and motion, space, creation of space, and force and motion. Oh my God, it's that simple. Counter space. You want to see something? Oh my God, it's so simple. Let's look at a magnet here. You see that? Dielectric inertial plane right in the middle here. Either side, force and motion. You see that? That line right in the center there? Oh my God. Look at that, it's so simple. Right there. The point of counter space. If you take this magnet, and if you're able to cut it, and it's actually ceramic, you can't really cut it, but if you're able to cut it like a big hunk of salami, each little slice, if you made 1,000 slices out of this magnet, each little slice would have its own dielectric inertial plane. It is self-centering. Why is it self-centering? Because it is counter space. It is the point of inertia. Everything over here, force and motion. Force and motion. Mother Nature is divinely simple. She's not an insane crack whore like quantum mechanics and general relativity would have you believe. She's not. Point of inertia. Force and motion. Inertia and acceleration. Now here's something counterintuitive. As acceleration increases, motion decreases. What? That makes no sense. Now think about that. Pause to think about it. As acceleration, let's just call this the idiot term that we currently use, gravity. Okay? It's no different than dielectric acceleration, DA, dielectric acceleration. But our idiots, we call it gravity. Increasing acceleration equals decreasing force and motion. Do you get it now? That makes no sense. Increasing acceleration is decreasing motion. Oh my God, I get it now. Oh, Mother Nature's so simple. It's so simple. Why didn't they teach this crap to you in school? Because we don't get it. We're still living in the Stone Age intellectually, especially when it comes to field theory. Stone Age. Every branch of science throughout history, 50 years ago, 100, 200, 300, 400, no matter when you go, they all thought their crap was right. Today is no different. We're technologically advanced and we're intellectually freaking morons. Well, some of us are. Most of us are anyway. You don't understand a damn thing. You just don't. Space, just as Tesla said, and he was correct, has no attributes. Space is neither a field nor a force. It acts on nothing and it does nothing. Let's use a really simple, stupid analogy to make things really simple. I love little simple demonstrations. What are we talking about when we talk about inertia? Well, you saw the center of the magnet, right? Dielectric inertial plane. Oh God, it stuck to the table. Dielectric inertial plane. You saw that? That thin line right in the middle? Yes? Dielectric inertia. Everything over here is force and motion. Everything over here is force and motion. You're actually measured with a Gauss meter. It's very simple. They have the centrifugal point of divergence, max here, mediocre here, really tight here. You can see this underneath the ferrocell. Yes, this tattooed fat asshole in front of you, well, not in front of you, is the first person in the world to figure out how a magnet works and what magnetism is. What is inertia? What is force and motion? What is space? Let's just make it really, really simple. Let's see if you can figure it out. Inertia, the loss of inertia. Let's assume this is inertia. Let's assume, remember our magnet? The dielectric inertial plane of the magnet? Right? Let's see if I can zoom out here. Let's zoom out. Dielectric inertial plane of the magnet. What happens with the loss of inertia? This is the dielectric inertial plane. Just assume that this is infinitely thin to the point of zero. What happens with the necessitated loss of inertia? Oh my God. That makes so much sense. What is the necessary byproduct of the loss of inertia? Do you see all these voids between these inertial points which are reciprocating across the middle? They're reciprocating to the center, reciprocating centrifugally, then returning centripetally, centrifugal, centripetal, divergence, convergence. What is happening as the loss of inertia occurs? Okay, we're releasing inertia. What happens? Oh, what is between these points of reciprocating loss of inertia? Oh my God, that's space. You can't reify space as something that does something. It's like reifying a shadow. A shadow is not a subject. It is an attribute. What is a shadow? It is the absence of light. A shadow does nothing. Well, you could say, well, a shadow makes you cold. A shadow keeps you... A shadow is absence. Space is the posterior attribute of the loss of inertia. Oh my God, that kind of makes sense. It seems so logical. Why, yes, it is. All these reciprocating points of inertia, which actually are circular, you can see it underneath the ferrocell. So simple. The loss of inertia necessitates the creation. So no, it's no different than saying that eating, you feed a horse a giant bucket of something, it's going to take a big shit of something. It's the necessitated attribute of something else, a posterior principle which is defining itself in attribution. There is no such thing. Here's the principle of the entire universe. There is no such thing as any principle that doesn't have an attribute.
That's kind of funny, because how's my audio, everybody? I haven't really tested it out. Yay, nay, good, bad. But yeah, Candy Telka crazy. But I was talking to Anthony Riley yesterday, and he was trying to tell you guys that the or whoever who was telling, he was trying to support the argument that the shadow of the moon penetrates the light of the sun, so that you can see the moon in front of the sun, even though it's behind the sun. And I was trying to tell him this. A shadow has no physical attributes to penetrate anything. Take a pencil, take two light bulbs, right? And put them, in wherever you want, near each other, from anywhere from inches away to miles away from each other. And then take an object and try to see if you can cast a shadow from one light bulb onto the other light bulb. See how well that works for you. Yeah, so I couldn't believe this guy. He actually has people following him into the flat earth realm of Lululand and crazy stuff like that. And with those type of ideas, and the guy really thinks he has, some sort of validity to be telling you that things that you understand about the globe just are not physically possible. So the ludicrousy in all of this, it almost is like, I started for a minute to think, you have to be kidding. Like, you're just playing. Like, this is funny. Like, you're not really serious, are you? You know what I mean? Like, because that's confusing that you'd really be serious if it's that silly. because we can show you right now that doesn't work. It was funny because he was trying to make a big stance about the word translucent. Now, I've been painting translucent signs and stuff for about 35 years, so I'm really familiar with the word translucent. So, translucent is where light can penetrate, but not detail. Detail wouldn't come through a translucent material, but the light itself would. So, to keep that in mind, I hadn't shown him the actual definition of translucent and what it really meant, even though he thought he was the authority on the word. But so he goes and he says, no, I show him. Sorry about that. I show him the photo of the eclipse that I have, where in the photo you can actually see the detail of the moon, right? Because of the proper filtering and everything that they use. And so you can see all the detail and all the mountains and the Sea of Tranquility and all that fun stuff, right? So before we went anywhere with anything, I said, Anthony Riley, can you see the detail there in the moon, in this photo? And he said, yes. I said, good. Now remember you said that. Now let's go read the definition for translucent. And he was like, no, but no. Just dirt. So, dirt. But, yeah. Sorry if you guys are still stuck on that flat earth stuff. Y'all gotta stop. I've already shown, everyone's shown. I mean, I've reshown things. I mean, shit, I didn't really have to do much out here except find some people who actually knew how to think that represented the right ideas, because shit, people were already busy cracking heads on that flat earth stuff. Oh goodness, I don't know what to say really without being mean. We're supposed to all be friends or whatever as far as in the truth, right? But if I catch somebody being little sneaky liars and clickbaiters talking about, look at the stars, this is what they really look like, and they're really showing manipulated photos of out of focus images, then isn't it aren't you supposed to say something? I mean, come on. And the flat earthers, you gullibles, you just ate that up. Most of you believed it wholeheartedly, promoted it, made your own videos, repaired it, got on Hangouts, argued it, denied all evidence proving that you were wrong. That's just cultish. That's weird, man. I mean, how y'all doing that? You can definitely see this is how you focus your camera. You can focus in on the same stars you said you were focusing on and on. Southern stuff. A cure. Right. We got a guy who can't even understand this simple idea of an object being closer, looking larger to your perception, and then being way further away, looking smaller to your perception. How everything in the universe comports to that physical law. And you see the sun and the moon do not comport to those parameters. It does not get larger and smaller, meaning it's not getting closer and further. It's pretty simple. A guy who can't even understand something that simple, who thinks the moon and the sun are close and they're local and they're moving around on top of a stationary plane, which is the most ridiculous thing, because you obviously couldn't have that and still have the lunar cycles the way they are. I mean, because moon phases would be location specific, for one. you know, oh, by the way, when we do our parallax and we see that there's 98 degrees in the angle that we're looking for from the 90-degree angle in our hypotenuse to find the distance of the object. If we set the object at 3,000 miles high, then the sun wouldn't even be on the map at all. And we have those angles. We know the light from the sun is what lights up the moon. Anybody saying that that's not true is just really goofing on y'all, man, big time. Talking about the moon is transparent and it sheds its own light and all. You know what? That's a misunderstanding from an article talking about the moon has some infrared light. That's not visible light. You're not seeing that in a glow in your eyeball mode like you see the moon phases. Don't even get that twisted. That's just electromagnetism. And that's because of the electric charges that are bouncing back and forth in the moon's perigee and epigee. Remember to hit that like button if you like what you're hearing. Remember to hit that super chat. Remember to hit that super chat and donate. Remember to donate. Because, you know, check out my... How can anybody say that with a straight face and be just talking about flat earth and nonsense, man? I can't believe it. You know what I'm saying? If you want to donate to my channel, though, feed the first person who needs food near you that you can find. That'll do it. I do not appreciate it. Just cut out the middleman, man. You know, you be the helper. You know, just go downtown, man, and throw out some cheeseburgers. Well, people love that stuff. Well, because you don't understand, Sean, doesn't mean much. Obviously, you know, we've talked. When it comes to stuff like that, it's not a big leap to think you might not understand, and that's fine. You know, it's not. No one's saying that's absolutely the facts either. They're saying, look, there is another method of possibility here, and it all comports to electromagnetism on any level. That's all. It's not. It's a lot better than saying the fabric of space and time, two ridiculous things that don't have, you know, any attributes, physical attributes, can't point you in the direction of time. I mean, time is just a series of events recorded so that we can remember, you know, how it goes. It's not as if time is a physical thing. That's just wish-washy words to try to hide literally the ether, you know. Sure, it's a medium, call it what you will, but don't try to, you know, say it's gravity alone in space and time, you know, and the idea of it being space and time is what's doing all this stuff, when there's all these real, very real measurable forces that we are ignoring to apply that theory. That's where my argument is against the standard theories, some of the standard theories. Oh, I'm reading these questions out of sync, but you know.
What do I mean by that? Light and illumination are an inseparable singular entity. Okay? You cannot differentiate out light from illumination. You cannot differentiate out inertia from the reciprocative loss of inertia. It's actually defined by an equation I discovered 12 years ago. It's an expression 1/5⁻³ It is very simplex. It is very divine. I've proven it. Underneath the ferrocell, the actual geometry of magnetic reciprocation, the phase shift of the poles. You have rarefaction on the North Pole and compression on the South Pole. I showed it to you in the seed experiments. Remember the seed experiments videos? Just is no different. Think of this as infinitely small, the dielectric inertial plane of a magnet, as I just showed you priorly. What happens with the loss of inertia, as it must necessarily reciprocate? Space is a posterior attribute. What Einstein and general relativity has done is they reified the horse shit as having to do with the horse. No, it is the posterior attribute of the goings-on, the actual attribution of the principle. What does it mean, the attribution of the principle? It means there's no difference between defining light and what light does, light and illumination. The Greeks call this the aoristos dies. The aoristos dies. In the ancient Egyptians they call it ahorismos. Is the indefinable attribute which has no quantity. It is only the attributional quality of what something does, which is indifferentiate from what it is. It sounds really so complicated. I mean, you can spend thousands and thousands of pages of text talking about this principle alone, but it's just so simple. The loss of inertia necessitates the creation of something else. But you can't reify that something else, i.e. space, as something that does something. Space is neither a field nor a force. It acts on nothing and it does nothing. Okay? We can't reify a shadow as something unto itself. It's a posterior attribute of the absence of illumination. We talk about light and shadows. A shadow has no... This is the same thing with emptiness. Emptiness is nothing. There is no such thing as emptiness. It's a qualifier of something else. These are all human conceptual reifications. The huge ones. Space and emptiness. Neither one of these exists. Neither one of these exist. Something X is empty of Y. Okay? This is a qualifier. Space is a qualifier too. Space is the absence of inertia. It's the posterior attribute of the reciprocation of inertia. Neither space nor emptiness exist. They're illusions. They're the holographic projecta. They're the phantasms of existential existence. They talk about an atom being 99.9999% empty space. And then if all the space inside every atom was removed, the Earth would be something like the size of a marble or smaller. It'd probably be actually a lot smaller than that. But it's not space. It's the reciprocation of the dynamis inside of an atom, which is releasing and reciprocating out magnetism. Magnetism, Faraday had it right. He never explained what a magnet was or what magnetism is. But he was so close, and nobody has come closer for those many, many decades ago than Faraday. He said that magnetism is the dielectric field. I don't know if you know who Faraday was. Most people do that are into field theory or electrical theory. They know who Faraday was. But he called it the dielectric field, which is exactly what it is. The loss of dielectric inertia as expressed by force and motion as magnetism reciprocates from either side. You can see this underneath the ferrocell. You can see it. I wished every one of you people could hold a ferrocell in your hand and actually see. It's like less than 1 micron thin, and yet you can see almost 4 inches of depth. The actual hypertrochoidal, the reciprocating precessional hyperboloid, and that's copyright mine, by the way, 2014. You know, the reciprocating precessional hyperboloid that expresses itself necessarily as a hypertrochoidal pattern. It's simplex pressure mediation. I mean, as a little child, do you remember having a bubble wand, and the end of it, of the bubble wands, the really fancy one, they'd have a square hole, and they'd have a round hole, and they'd have like a triangular hole, and you dip this crap in the bubble stuff. And of course it doesn't matter which hole you blow it out of, blow the sun, it doesn't matter which hole you blew, you'd end up with a round bubble, right? Pressure mediation, simplex. Matter if you're blowing the soapy film crap out of the square, the round, or the triangular hole, you end up with a round bubble, right? You remember that crap as a child? Same thing with a magnet. It doesn't matter if this magnet is square, triangular, circular. There's all sorts of freaky-ass shapes that a magnet can be cast into. But the field underneath the ferrocell will be exactly as I predicted. Exactly the same. It is always the same. It has to be the same. It's no different than the old plumber's motto that the water flows downhill. It's simplex pressure mediation of a field. But a field has no quanta. Okay? There is no quantity in a field. This is what scares general relativity and quantum mechanics so much that they devised a bullshit term to replace ether. They're like, well, it's we're going to call it quantum fluid. Ether is the giant evil word that these assholes will never use. It's the most evil word in the world to them. Just bring up the word ether. You can feel, you can hear their sphincter pucker. But the only way you really want to scare them and shut them the hell up, you just run into someone with their head just so full, it's just ready to pop. They think they're so effing smart, and yet they're so stupid. Just ask them like a child would, okay? Sir, can you define this one word? No! They will never define it. They might blow smoke up your ass or give you, just some sort of, well, it's too complex for you to, no, it's you don't understand what this word is. Everything in the universe is fields, and science thinks we're technologically advanced, although not that technologically advanced. But we're intellectually stupid. Okay, we've invented a whole lot of crap because we know how to recreate things, we know how a lot of things work, but we can't explain them. Okay, descriptions are not explanations. And everything in the universe is this: fields. Quantum mechanics, general relativity, and current science has never defined this word. Never an explanation for this word. This is how you scare the piss out of these assholes that think they're so smart. Just ask them to define this word. It's like, no. You gave a description. I want an explanation, asshole. Explain this word. Okay? They can't do it. Not even to save their own life could they ever define this word. Explain it, excuse me. Anyway, thanks for watching, and catch you later.
One of the exciting things of coming down here is that there really was no academic center down here below 14th Street. And so having Mount Sinai come to Union Square, we're really bringing not only the community feeling back into the community, but also delivering a world-class care and academic-driven care that you just can't get anywhere else.
Hello, I'd like to make a simple video on field theory that hopefully even a 12-year-old child could understand. Now, instead of looking this as a circle, just think it as an infinite point without spatial volume. And if we look at it this way, we're more easily able to understand that. We think of this as an indivisible line that actually has no extension. We're talking about unmanifest inertia, or what quantum mechanics and general relativity and their insanity have called dark matter or quantum fluid, which is just nothing other than a euphemism for what Tesla, Heaviside, Steinmetz, Faraday, and all the greats of electrical theory that gave us 100% of our current electrical grid and system. Einstein gave us nothing of that. Nothing. Okay? He invented nothing, he discovered nothing, and his quote-unquote theory of relativity is mostly stolen from Henri Poincaré. Excuse me, my French is not so great. Henri Poincaré. I'm sure I'm still pronouncing that wrong. Anyway, as far as field theory, we only have two field modalities, and we have one field. There is only one field. Now we think in terms of electrostatics, like dielectricity. We think in terms of magnetic field, electrical, and then we think of gravitational field. But ultimately, I hope to make this really fast and simple for you to understand it, that there's only one field, and there's the loss of that field as expressed by magnetism, i.e. the loss of inertia, because there's only two principles that rule the entire universe: force in motion and inertia and acceleration. Well, how do you tie all four of them together rationally? Now, actually, let me show you this. Now, as you've seen underneath the ferrocell, a magnet, doesn't matter what shape it is, looks exactly like this. It looks like a torus. It looks like well, of course, most people can't visualize that. I can. A reciprocating processional hyperboloid, which sounds complicated, but is divinely simplex. Now, you see this spirograph-like hypertrochoidal pattern. If you're able to get it underneath the camera better, I'll show it to you in a slightly uncompressed fashion. There you go. You actually see a torus, a toroid, a spirograph, a hypertrochoid. That's the expression of the loss of inertia. Now, as Faraday called magnetism, he called it the dielectric field. But what does that mean specifically? It means that the necessitated loss of inertia, i.e. the ether, must be expressed as the creation of space, and of course the posterior attribute of the creation of space is a measure of movements of magnitude, which we call time, but of course time does not exist. Time is a human contrivance. Here we have dielectricity with absolutely no manifestation as a linear propagation. Now, we think of a single point, i.e. the ether, as being unmanifest. A longitudinal propagation, such as found in electromagnetism, i.e. radio or regular light, obviously has a longitudinal pulse between each waveform of the electrical value and the magnetic value of the waveform of the transverse electromagnetism. Now here we have electricity, which by the way is phi times psi q in Planck electrification. Electricity is nothing other than the hybrid of electricity and magnetism operating together, which is found in obviously frequency and amplitude, constantly pulsing back and forth like this. Well, what frequency? What amplitude? Obviously, we have the entire EM spectrum and we have electricity. So electricity is a hybrid of dielectricity and of magnetism, operating at a frequency and an amplitude, obviously so. Now, in the case of, to make this really simple so that a child could understand, like electromagnet that pulls up cars, obviously an enormous amount of voltage is actually dropped to the lifter, like the lifter magnet that picks up dead cars and re-scraps out things. Now, electricity doesn't terminate as magnetism, or doesn't terminate into magnetism by dumping that charge and creating a large electromagnet. It loses its dielectric component. So electricity terminates not into magnetism as wrongly thought, but as magnetism by losing its dielectric component. In other words, all that electricity that is actually brought through electromagnet to lift up dead cars so they could be scrapped is nothing other than the loss of the dielectric component of electricity, which means you have an extremely high Gauss field that is able to pick up multi-ton cars with that electromagnet. It is that electricity terminates as magnetism by losing its dielectric component, not into magnetism, but as magnetism, because electricity is the hybrid of dielectricity and magnetism. Phi times psi equals Q, Planck, and electrification. Electricity, by definition, denotatively, is the combination of two things, dielectricity and magnetism. So by losing its dielectric component, the electricity manifests itself in the electromagnet, for example, as a huge, enormous, very powerful, high Gauss magnetic field. Now, where does gravity come into play? Well, we think gravity is something different. Now, we know in galactic jets, we see enormous amounts of shooting matter shooting out billions of light years at either end of galactic jets. Now, the necessary loss of inertia, which manifests itself as longitudinal dielectricity, is an equation. It's 1 over phi to the power of -3, which some people would think would be a number, but it's actually an expression. And that expression, if we were to think of this as a 0 point, which is invisible rather than seeing the circle, that equation necessitates the expression, which we know that the attributional nature of the ether expresses itself as longitudinal dielectricity by that equation that I discovered 12 years ago. So where does gravity come into play? Gravity, like electricity, is nothing other than a hybrid. So what is gravity? Well, we talk about what denotes gravity. We're talking about mass, i.e. matter. Matter is nothing more than a dielectric condensate. Okay, it's like taking carbon dioxide and freezing it to its solid state. Now, obviously, that is a huge hyperbole, and that's a supreme oversimplification.
Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. Today, physicist Wal Thornhill concludes his three-part presentation on the early science results from NASA's Juno mission to the gas giant Jupiter. As previously noted, like countless other recent space discoveries, the mission findings are challenging not only long-held assumptions about Jupiter, but also consensus theories of planet and star formation and the history of our solar system. On the question of Jupiter's internal structure and composition, Thornhill offered the provocative thesis that Jupiter is hollow. In this episode, Thornhill presents his predictions for forthcoming Juno revelations, including the mystery of what lies beneath the planet's great red spot. We begin with some further explanation of electrogravity.
Of course, the idea of a hollow Earth with an inner surface like a geode is a formidable challenge to our entrenched belief that the Earth has a dense core. It's a belief that can only be overcome by explanation, by demonstration, and by a willingness to consider the evidence. Consider for a moment that the electrogravity model presented here applies equally to any spinning object, where the heavy nuclei in each atom are offset radially from the spin axis to form tiny radial electric dipoles. This is the simple reason why inertial mass is equivalent to gravitational mass. The centrifugal force is not a fictitious or pseudo force, it's identical to gravity. It's the reason why a spinning space station like the one famously modelled in Stanley Kubrick's landmark film A Space Odyssey produces its own gravity. This raises the question how someone in the space station knows they are spinning, only by looking out of a window and seeing the stars sweep past. The so-called fixed stars are the reference standard for all motion in the electric universe, because the electric force of gravity connects all matter in the universe, practically in real time. That's why gyros are used for inertial navigation, because they tend to lock themselves gravitationally to the matter in the rest of the universe. Think about it. In a universe of countless negatively polarized stars and planets repelling each other, a gyro has a positively polarized rim, which is attracted to all of those celestial bodies. Sadly, those who have demonstrated what seem to be anti-gravity effects of gyros have not had any useful understanding of gravity from physicists to explain what they were observing. Most significant was Professor Eric Laithwaite's 1974-75 Royal Institution's Christmas lecture, finally posted online in December 2013, which I recommend watching. As for willingness to consider eyewitness evidence, scientists at the Royal Institution behaved predictably by refusing to broadcast the remarkable lecture on the grounds, as the Royal Institution website says, and I quote, "Laithwaite appears to have used various engineering approximations in his calculations on the behaviour of gyroscopes, and when told by professional mathematicians that once the calculations were done rigorously, there was no discrepancy, he refused to believe them. These are the same professional mathematicians who can't define mass or energy in terms of matter and have no sensible model of the real nature of gravity." Laithwaite was only one of 3 people since 1945 to deliver more than one series of the Royal Institution's Christmas lectures. His first series was the first to be televised on the new BBC Two channel. Back to Jupiter's origin and composition. Decades ago, the plasma cosmologist and Nobel Prize-winning plasma physicist Hans Alfvén predicted that stars would be formed along Birkeland current filaments inside molecular clouds. He famously said, "Gravitational systems are the ashes of former electrical systems." Infrared space telescopes have recently confirmed this, but no acknowledgement has been forthcoming from settled astrophysics because of their taboo against electricity in space. The electric universe simply adds that both stars and planets are formed in the same event. The cosmic lightning characteristically snakes about and is observed to toss the newly formed bodies out laterally, but collisions are avoided by repulsive gravity. The thousands of crazy exoplanetary systems are simply explained by the inward gravitational pressure of all other bodies in the universe against the repulsive gravitational force of the nearest dominant body. Hot Jupiters orbiting their star closely is not a puzzle when we get rid of the gravitational accretion and merger by collision myth. On the question of the composition of Jupiter, plasma physicists have shown that Birkeland currents draw the heavy elements towards the centres of celestial bodies and the gases form their atmospheres, with hydrogen and helium outermost. So the composition of Jupiter can't be assessed from its atmosphere. Jupiter is not mostly hydrogen and helium. All of the issues raised mean Jupiter is a solid shell composed of heavy elements. It will have structure both on its external and internal surfaces. Jupiter is not, as Scott said of the simplistic standard model, boring and uniform inside. Anywhere you look will not look the same. So let's return to NASA's teleconference. Scott Bolton, Juno principal investigator, said, "There are motions deep inside Jupiter that people hadn't anticipated, and the gravity field is consistent with that. What we were really looking for was a core, whether there was a compact core or no core, and instead what we found was that it looks really fuzzy. There may be a core there, and it may be very big, and it may be partially dissolved. That came as a big surprise to us, that there was no core. These mysteries extended to our magnetic field experiment." Jack Connolly, Juno deputy principal investigator, said, "On Earth the compass doesn't deviate much from the north-south direction. On Jupiter the magnetic field was both stronger than we expected, where we expected it to be strong, and it was weaker than we expected, where we expected it to be weak. There are small spatial variations which indicate we may be very close to the source, so it may be above the metallic hydrogen and may operate in the molecular hydrogen envelope. The electrogravity model of hollow celestial objects removes any idea of planetary magnetic fields being generated by internal dynamos. That hypothesis has never been able to successfully model the complexity and variety of planetary magnetic fields found in the solar system. It doesn't work for the Sun either. As Faraday found, magnetic fields are intimately associated with electric currents, but electrogravity is also associated with magnetism. Both forces have the same origin in the distortion of protons and electrons. The Earth shows a connection between the two forces, which requires a fundamental reinterpretation. The simplest explanation for a dipole magnetic field aligned roughly with the axis of rotation of a planet is that the planet carries a surface charge, which constitutes a current. This was considered for the origin of the Earth's field, but it was rejected because the electric current of 10 to the 9 amperes required seemed too high because the charge it implied would generate a tremendously strong electric field at the Earth's surface, which doesn't exist. However, there is a clear air electric field of about 100 volts per metre. The problem with this argument is that to measure voltage requires a reference, and the Earth or ground is considered our reference voltage. And it is clear that the Earth has plenty of electrons to carry the return current of our power networks. But the fundamental error comes from the belief that stars and planets can be considered electrically neutral in space plasma. This has been proven incorrect in the case of the Sun, where numerous electrical double layers or plasma sheaths have been found in the interplanetary plasma that reduce the electric field between them. The Earth has plasma sheaths in the ionosphere and magnetosphere which do the same thing, so the 100 volts per metre measured in the lower atmosphere doesn't give a true picture of the charge on the Earth. Venus's lack of a magnetic field could be down to its ultra-slow rotation, but it leaves Uranus and Neptune's oddly offset magnetic fields unanswered. It seems more probable that the cool solid shells of planets retain some of their nascent magnetic fields when the ambient field of their birthing Birkeland current was at its peak. Planetary rotation can also be understood as an imprint of the rotating Birkeland current filament. The slow retrograde rotation of Venus, its heat and lack of a magnetic field, argues for a different, recent birth. The global myths of Venus as the archetypal comet match this idea and introduce an alternative birth process for smaller rocky planets and moons by a process of electrogravitic expulsion from a much larger body. This proposal makes sense of the large numbers of satellites of the gas giants and the spectacular icy rings of Saturn, which are of very recent origin. Finally, a word about Jupiter's Great Red Spot. Its continued presence for centuries is another argument for a solid body beneath the clouds. Its giant tornadic form is that of a continuous electrical discharge vortex from an elevated surface feature acting like a lightning rod, which could be the birth scar of one of Jupiter's moons. The Juno spacecraft is due to observe the Great Red Spot closely on its next close encounter with Jupiter, where I expect even greater gravitational and electromagnetic anomalies to be found associated with the spot.
For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info. Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. At the forthcoming Thunderbolts Project Conference, EU 2017, Future Science in Phoenix, Arizona, experts in a variety of disciplines will present groundbreaking evidence for the role of electricity in nature. In the Electric Universe community, many contributors have come from a background in engineering, where applied technologies and industrial processes may provide intriguing analogs for natural phenomena. One of these speakers will be Garrett Hill, the CTO of the company ThrivalTech, where he and his team develop plasma technologies for various applications, including the internal combustion engine, with the goal of providing the world with more effective emissions control solutions. We asked Garrett to introduce himself and to explain what has drawn him to the Electric Universe community.
My background started out in the performance automotive sector, where I was designing, building, and racing vehicles. And I developed a lot of skills there, but none that immediately seemed to pertain to this concept of an electric universe, besides like capacitive discharge spark plugs, right? So that you get more bang for your buck in the cylinder. And after I stopped working in that sector, I immediately jumped into atmospheric research and was doing some atmospheric research in Colorado, and quickly realized that there was a lot of electrical activity going on in the eastern part of Colorado, as well as there's Tornado Alley, which is close to that zone. And that was really exciting because I had met up with a crew who was sort of veterans in chasing storms and capturing data. I jumped on board, and we ended up chasing a tornado through about 3 states, caught up with it. This is in 2009 in Wyoming, and got up close and personal with an F2 tornado, and actually went inside the tornado. And I got a real intimate interaction with the storm. The balance of all of these forces, these electrical discharges that were happening inside of the clouds, and the anvil that was sort of leading the storm in close proximity to the tornado, and all the mesocyclones that were surrounding the zone. And after I came out of that tornado, it was really clear that there was an immense amount of knowledge to be had by observing nature. And these principles that we obviously can be using to better humanity and better the world at large. And so I immediately dove into R&D on different types of technologies that would be able to utilize these principles that I became so intimate with in that storm: vortex dynamics, plasma discharges, and also experimenting different ways to interact with gravity, to understand gravity better, this thing that we call gravity, right? After a couple of years of that, I ended up meeting up with a crew here in Ashland, Oregon, and we developed a company called ThrivalTech, where we initially set out to make the internal combustion engine more efficient and pollute less, if at all. And in our R&D, we discovered a lot of amazing things, where in various types of plasmas that we could generate, we were able to observe a lot of interesting phenomena when we, for instance, in our diesel particulate oxidation technology, of which we have patented, where we were subjecting carbon particulate to high voltage electric fields, and we would get this effect that would strongly resemble self-assembly. I mean, it was really fascinating, really amazing. It was a bit jaw-dropping, these things that spur out of some rudimentary experiments that you're not anticipating, and it was really amazing to discover that you can generate these type of effects that strongly resemble biomechanical motion or swarm behaviors that you see in fish or in birds or in insects and so on. It's littered throughout nature, swarm behaviors and self-assembly. And so when we saw that we could manipulate this carbon material, which essentially comprised carbon nanospheres, we were able to really get a good handle on how we can utilize those principles to reduce emissions on a diesel engine, for instance. And so by discovering or rediscovering this inherent effect when you put those two things together, carbon nanospheres and really strong electric fields, you get this type of effect where you have a more apparent control over carbon particulate inside of a diesel engine. All of this soot that's spewing out of all these diesel engines is a big issue for everybody on this planet as we breathe the same air. And so, through these phenomena that we discovered in the lab, we wanted to really apply it. So that's exactly what we did. We immediately directly applied that to the engine, and now we have a really good and effective technology to reduce the carbon particulate matter in the internal combustion engine. So that's one application. Another is when we were looking to be able to reform different gases, essentially. We wanted to, take the hydrogen out of the hydrocarbon bond, and we wanted to separate everything, right? But we wanted to use the hydrogen for hydrogen-enhanced combustion as sort of a pre-ignition fuel treatment system. And the only way we could do that efficiently was what academic science has taught us is fuel reformation of various kinds, but the science behind some of these, I would say, unconventional methods of fuel reformation were largely unexplored. And with regard to applying a high voltage electric arc, initiating an arc discharge, and then applying a magnetic field to it, you end up getting this really beautiful rotating plasma that strongly resembles a galactic plane in a lot of different modes. When you look at something that's supposedly light years in diameter, and you're looking at all the Hubble telescope images and so on, and then you look at your laboratory experiment and it's 1.5 inches in diameter, but it's really challenging to tell the difference just in the image, that starts giving us a lot of ideas on what's going on in nature. And so we were able to utilize that phenomenon that we rediscovered in our lab to apply to a really efficient method of fuel reformation, where we could generate high-quality synthesis gas from hydrocarbon fuels of various types by applying these principles. And we since then have archived thousands of videos and images on so many different types of benchtop galaxies, for lack of better words. And we're doing a whole classification chart similar to how Hubble initiated his classification chart, just because of the fact that there's so many different ways you can change the input parameters and yield staggeringly similar optical phenomenon as you would see coming out of Hubble. And so, more and more we're realizing that there's a strong electric field component to a lot of the natural principles that we can see throughout our daily life. And we are ever more excited and inspired to keep on applying that and developing technologies that will better us all.
For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info.
Before we start, I just want to say if anyone still doesn't have FiOS, please stay out of the way so your lag doesn't get us all killed. Ben, what's so good about...
Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. On August 17, 2017, the Thunderbolts Project will begin its international conference, Future Science, in Phoenix, Arizona. At the conference, speakers from a variety of disciplines, including engineering, physics, mathematics, and the life sciences will present new, groundbreaking research on the role of electricity in nature. A keynote speaker will be Professor Donald Scott, who has spent recent years developing his own model of the structure of a Birkeland current. As noted in several Space News episodes, In recent years, the term Birkeland current has increasingly appeared in scientific literature, with scientists recognizing the role the currents play in earthly auroras and other atmospheric phenomena. Recently, Dr. Scott's prediction that the unique signature of Birkeland currents is their counter-rotation has been visually verified. At the Thunderbolts conference, Dr. Scott will discuss his investigation into the role of cosmic Birkeland currents and the evidence that these currents power many galaxies in deep space.
We in the electric universe are involved in the investigation of things that happened very long ago or far, far away. And one of the challenging things about that is trying to get any kind of hard, substantive evidence to support your ideas. And hopefully we can come up with, at least we always look for, evidence that interlocks with other evidence. Anyway, we've long suspected that electrical currents flow through cosmic space and they have real effects on things that we can observe. For example, Christian Birkeland predicted that the cause of the Earth's auroras were electric currents, and he was right. And now we can call them Birkeland currents in his honor. They are there. They flow down into the north and south poles of Earth, and they've been measured, and they're now known to exist. Nobody really argues about that anymore. We've suspected that if it was true about the Earth, though, it might be true about other planets as well. So how can we obtain supporting evidence for that, other than maybe going there and measuring them with a space probe? Well, a couple of years ago, I was able to develop a mathematical model for what the structure of a Birkeland current would probably look like if we could actually see one and take it apart and dissect it. Actually, Birkeland currents have a unique structure, totally unique. They consist of a collection of concentric cylinders that counter-rotate, like a bunch of pipes inside one another, each one going in the opposite direction from the ones on either side of it. Or I shouldn't say either side of it, but inside it or outside of it. Anyway, each cylinder, one inside the other, rotates in the opposite direction from its neighbor. So when I saw that the north poles of both Saturn and Jupiter are covered with counter-rotating cloud belts, now that was the kind of corroboration that's hard to ignore. Counter-rotation is almost uniquely a property of Birkeland currents. Doesn't mean it can't happen from other means, but it's very, very difficult. Try to think of it yourself. How do you make these cylinders go in the opposite directions? That's very tough. That's a tough problem. So when we see it, we're encouraged to think that we may be seeing a situation in which Birkeland currents are present, or at least we should allow for the possibility that that's what's going on. The Earth's auroras exhibit counter-rotation, and so that's additional supporting evidence that indeed, yes, Birkeland currents are impinging on the North Pole and South Pole of the Earth. So why not on Saturn, Jupiter, and the other planets? We see these counter-rotating cloud belts, and that supports our ideas. So we also think, however, that strings of Birkeland currents connect galaxies in our universe. If we can show that lots of these galaxies contain counter-rotating belts of stars, that would be strong evidence for the presence of Birkeland currents. Otherwise, how do you get those belts of stars to go in opposite directions? In this summer's EU conference, I'm going to present evidence of a lot of galactic counter-rotation. That astronomers claim that this is very rare, that very few galaxies exhibit this. Well, maybe. But it's quite difficult to observe and measure it. And I will try to show the folks at the conference how that's done. Does that prove that Birkeland currents are responsible for galactic rotation? No, of course not. But it's very difficult to come up with another mechanism that can produce galaxy counter-rotation that isn't electrical, that isn't a Birkeland current. Anyway, lastly, at the conference, sort of talking about the other end of the spectrum of dimension, from huge galaxies to something very small on the other end, relatively small at least. We suspect that storms here on Earth may involve Birkeland currents. And I'm going to be presenting new evidence that they indeed are. They're intimately involved with both hurricanes and tornadoes. Also, this last week, I discovered, thanks to my informants who say, hey, Don, you should see this. And so a fellow sent me a website showing that Birkeland currents are a possible explanation of the mysterious circulating ocean currents, like, for instance, the Gulf Stream. People have been asking for decades, centuries, actually millennia, as to why do these big streams, these oceanic rivers of water flow around and around and around. What drives them? You can hear people talk about dynamos inside the Earth or something, but that's like the dog ate my homework kind of explanation. They are, we think, now quite obviously the result of those Birkeland currents that come into the poles of the Earth. And I will be talking about that and presenting evidence to that effect in August, and I look forward to it.
For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info. Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. Scientists working on NASA's historic Juno mission to the gas giant Jupiter have recently presented their early findings for the first time. Like so many other recent space missions, what they have discovered is not what they expected. As reported by NewScientist.com, the findings are already challenging assumptions about everything from the planet's atmosphere to its interior. One of the biggest surprises is the enormous strength of Jupiter's magnetic field, even more powerful and, quote, much more irregular than scientists expected, challenging long-held beliefs about the so-called dynamo inside of Jupiter that is thought to produce its magnetic field. As principal investigator Scott Bolton stated, "I didn't expect all the theories to be wrong, but there's motion going on in the planet we did not anticipate." In part one of this two-part presentation, physicist and chief science advisor to the Thunderbolts Project, Wal Thornhill, begins his in-depth analysis of the Juno data, including the many victories that already seem evident for the electric universe theory.
On May 25th, NASA held a media teleconference on the first science from Juno at Jupiter. Sadly, the science used old beliefs to interpret data that conflicted with those beliefs. The result is that Jupiter up close looks nothing like the once upon a time, billions of years ago, stories we have been told. Not one model of the interior of Jupiter survived Juno's close encounter with the planet, except for the electric universe model. So here's an electric universe analysis of the material presented at the teleconference. Scott Bolton, Juno principal investigator, began by noting how different Jupiter looks from what we expected. He said, "Juno is, in effect, looking inside Jupiter. Jupiter was thought to be boring and uniform inside. Anywhere you looked, it would all look the same. What we're finding is anything but that. It's very different, very complex. The North Pole of Jupiter has incredibly complex features, cyclones and anticyclones all over the poles that weren't expected. If anyone had shown you a photo like this a few years ago, they wouldn't recognize it as Jupiter. Also, the North and South Poles don't really look like each other, which is also a puzzle to scientists. Are the cyclones stable, or will they last like the Great Red Spot, which has lasted 300 years at least? Or is this something that's dynamic?" A Cambridge University textbook says that Jupiter, with its mass of 300 Earths, is composed mostly of hydrogen and helium, with a heavy element core of roughly 10 Earth masses. Being so far from the Sun, it was expected that solar heating would play little part in Jupiter's atmospheric motion, so that it should be boring and uniform inside. So there's an unexplained energy source driving the numerous giant cyclones at the poles of Jupiter and the ammonia plume at the equator that has not been factored into settled planetary science. But 23 years ago, there was a natural probe of Jupiter's atmosphere that exposed that energy source. It was the Shoemaker-Levy 9 comet fragment encounters with Jupiter during the week of 16 to 22nd of July 1994. Notice I didn't say impacts. There are many problems with the settled science of that event, so it's good policy to return to the earliest reports of those events because of the human tendency to forget, rationalize, or ignore evidence that doesn't fit our beliefs. Some astronomers predicted that the comet fragments were too small to have much effect when they hit Jupiter. There's a chance we will see very little, said the late Eugene Shoemaker, co-discoverer of the comet, shortly before the event. Shoemaker-Levy 9 couldn't even be found in images taken before the comet broke up on its first brush with Jupiter. Astronomer Brian Marsden thought it was only 1 to 2 kilometres in diameter. It's going to be tough to see much, he concluded. I don't think there's going to be a very large explosion. So the eventual dazzling display baffled astronomers. Ultraviolet images showed glowing streaks in Jupiter's northern hemisphere, which appeared as almost mirror images of glows from the impact site of fragment G in the southern hemisphere. The Jovian auroral displays appeared to be triggered by electrically charged particles released during the impacts in the south, following a looping arc northward along the planet's magnetic field until they fell back into the planet's atmosphere, creating a glow in the north. After a year's analysis by hundreds of talented scientists, Nature issued the following statement. First seen was a faint glow that slowly increased in brightness on a timescale of tens of seconds, believed to be due to a large number of small meteors in the coma surrounding each Shoemaker-Levy 9 fragment. The meteor shower was followed by a sharp increase in brightness as the main part of the fragment entered the Jovian atmosphere. A few tens of seconds later, a fireball exploded up the chimney created in the atmosphere by the bolide. Forget the ad hoc meteor shower. Electrically charged comet fragments would be expected to exhibit a brightening cometary coma as they approach Jupiter, just as comets do on approaching the electric sun. The glow increases until a sudden arc discharge occurs between the comet fragment and the charged body of Jupiter. The same effect is often seen when a sun-grazing comet causes a coronal mass ejection from the sun. The steep increase in brightness that astronomers observed was more like a lightning flash than the light curve of a bright bolide's entry into the Earth's atmosphere. In fact, it was expected that the fragments would flare several times like those fireballs. That didn't happen. That idea and the fireball exploding up a chimney from the clouds below are simply assumptions of the mechanical impact model. And there were many other anomalies for the impact model. As we shall see, there is no evidence that the comet fragments got down to the clouds intact. In Jupiter's plasma environment, we can expect electrical forces to affect the trajectories of the charged comet fragments. Such forces would cause deviations from the expected impact times. And in fact, impact times were on average 8 minutes later than expected. One of the largest pieces, fragment G, showed spectral evidence of magnesium when it was just 10 hours from impact. Such metals only show up when comets graze around the Sun. But whatever was tearing magnesium from the fragment as it sped in through Jupiter's magnetosphere couldn't drive off enough water to be detectable. That failure to observe water gave rise to questioning whether the comet might be an asteroid. After all, only the fuzziness of Shoemaker-Levy 9 identified it as a comet, and some asteroids have been observed occasionally to show fuzziness. The electrical comet model explains each and every mystery of Shoemaker-Levy 9. An electric comet is as dry as an asteroid. The fuzziness of a comet is due to the electrical coronal glow of its enveloping plasma sheath. When the electrical stress at the comet's surface increases beyond a threshold, arcs will appear at the surface which sputter atoms such as magnesium from the minerals there. That this should occur shortly before the collision is not surprising. Jupiter's magnetosphere is the most active electrical environment for a comet, other than a close encounter with the Sun. The Galileo spacecraft on its way to Jupiter, the Hubble Space Telescope, and many terrestrial observatories tracked the fragments as they approached Jupiter. Their data highlighted another mystery. Some collisions that were calculated to occur just beyond Jupiter's limb, and that should have been invisible to all but the Galileo spacecraft, were seen from the Earth. In a NASA news report, Dr. Andrew Ingersoll said, "In effect, we are apparently seeing something we didn't think we had any right to see." Dr. Torrance Johnson of JPL commented, it seems clear that something was happening high enough to be seen beyond the curve of the planet. The predictable electrical event high in Jupiter's ionosphere prior to the fragment striking the upper atmosphere did indeed occur. What then were the vertical jets seen rising 3,000 kilometres above Jupiter's clouds and known as plumes? And what were the crescent-shaped dark features that resulted from the fallback of the plume onto the atmosphere? The dark material came to be known technically as the brown stuff, its nature unknown. The geophysicist and expert on impact cratering, Dr. J. Melosh, suggested that the comet fragments would penetrate Jupiter's atmosphere so deeply before exploding that they would be swallowed up and we would see very little. Others proposed that each fragment would dig a tunnel of fire in Jupiter's atmosphere before exploding and sending a plume of hot atmospheric and cometary material from the top of the tunnel into space. This was the plume model that was explored to try to explain the strange, dark fallout pattern. However, the plume model could not explain the clear zone between the dark core and the crescent, nor could it explain the radial lines dissecting the crescent. All of the unexplained oddities began to make sense if a plasma discharge occurred between the highly charged comet fragments and Jupiter's ionosphere. That's why the light from fragments that were expected to impact beyond the limb was unexpectedly visible. The light from a discharge beyond Jupiter's limb but 3,000 kilometres above Jupiter's cloud tops would have been visible from Earth. The electrical nature of the event also explains why comet fragments of different sizes created flashes at the same height. The discharges occurred as each charged fragment hit Jupiter's ionosphere, or electrical plasma sheath, well above the atmosphere. The comet fragments were destroyed like exploding capacitors before reaching the atmosphere. Those ionospheric discharges would have triggered an upward discharge from the atmosphere below. In the very low pressure of space, it would have been in the form of a compact plasmoid. Evidence for this interpretation is the observation that the so-called plumes continued to radiate at the shortest wavelengths, which is not to be expected from a rising hot gaseous plume as it expands and cools. Additional evidence for a powerful plasma discharge came from the fallout material, the brown stuff. The Hubble Space Telescope found most surprising were the strong signatures from sulfur-bearing compounds like diatomic sulfur or disulfur. Disulfur is a molecule with a very short lifetime, and its origin is one of the great mysteries of comet chemistry. However, if we turn to the only known natural source, Jupiter's innermost Galilean moon, Io, gaseous disulfur has been detected emanating from the vicinity of Pelee volcano. Plasma scientists, following a suggestion from Professor Tommy Gold, recognized the so-called volcanoes on Io as an electrical exchange with Jupiter, producing umbrella-shaped plasma gun discharge plumes, which have dusted the moon with colourful sulfur molecules, including red and brown variants in circular electromagnetic fallout patterns. Now, a large quantity of oxygen was observed in the Shoemaker-Levy 9 events at Jupiter. So it seems that a powerful plasma discharge is capable of fusing two oxygen atoms to produce a sulfur atom, which then combine to form the colourful molecular sulfur variants, including the short-lived disulfur molecule. This also means that Io was originally an icy moon like its Galilean siblings, but has had the oxygen in its ice progressively converted to the observed global dusting of yellow sulfur. This is currently the only proposal to simply explain this oddity of Io. It may be that children listening on their school's radio telescope provided the most significant observation of all. They said that the Shoemaker-Levy 9 collisions were accompanied by bursts of radio emission, just like those from sunspot activity on the Sun. New Scientist called this Jupiter's surprise radio broadcast. Never in 23 years of Jupiter observations have we seen such a rapid and intense increase in radio emission, said Michael Klein of JPL. The radio emission peaked on the 23rd of July, just after the last comet fragment hit, and it declined thereafter. Klein had expected dust from the comet to absorb electrons, which otherwise might contribute to radio emissions. Instead, extra electrons were supplied by a source which, as yet, is a mystery. But it's no mystery. Like all comets, Shoemaker-Levy 9 was negatively charged, its fragments supplying copious electrons for the radio emissions. The fate of Shoemaker-Levy 9 thus provides a consistent picture of the electrical nature of comets and Jupiter. Leading plasma physicist Hans Alfvén drew the Sun's electrical circuit, showing the planets orbiting in its equatorial current sheet, known incorrectly to astrophysicists as the solar wind. So it's electrical energy from the Sun's circuit that drives the weather on planets with atmospheres, like Jupiter. The cyclones and anticyclones at the poles are the footprints of twisting Birkeland currents following Jupiter's magnetic field into the polar regions. As a result, Jupiter's magnetic field is more complex than expected in those regions. Fran Bagenal, a planetary scientist at the University of Colorado, Boulder, said, "Rather than having one big wire carrying all the current, you've got multiple little wires all spread out." This scattered pattern means that the structure and origin of Jupiter's northern and southern lights are more complicated than previously thought, because the electrically charged particles that produce them are flowing along a variety of paths. On further inspection, we should see evidence of the unique signatures of Birkeland currents in the features of Jupiter's poles. We can learn more about Jupiter's electrical features by re-examining Christian Birkeland's experiments, published in 1908, than all of the modern computer modelling based on invalid concepts. All you will hear from experts are answers to questions they pose for themselves, but their narrow expertise doesn't fit them to answer questions outside their training. That's why paradigm shifts are so tough. Meanwhile, stay tuned to find out what's really beneath the clouds of Jupiter and its great red spot.
For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info. Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. For many decades, the standard cosmological model has stated that the universe began many billions of years ago with a primordial explosion called the Big Bang. Beginning from an unimaginably hot, dense point, material rushed outward at nearly the speed of light. And to this day, the physical expansion of the universe is thought to continue. When scientists found evidence for the apparent acceleration of the expansion rate of the universe, the hypothetical influence of dark energy was invented. For a scientific hypothesis to be testable, it must make predictions. And the technological data available to test the Big Bang hypothesis has never been finer. For over 5 years on this series, we have reported on numerous theory-shattering discoveries that challenge the very underpinnings of the Big Bang. From impossibly huge structures that exceed the size limits for any object at this time in the Big Bang universe, to so-called ancient stars whose chemical composition is completely wrong if they formed from material in the early universe, to grand design galaxies that display a complexity of form that defy their theoretical age, to evidence that the so-called expansion of the universe is accelerating at an impossibly fast rate, even accounting for dark energy's influence. Many scientists have acknowledged the major problems these discoveries pose for Big Bang cosmology. Nevertheless, consensus scientific opinion remains that the Big Bang is the best current theory for the origins of our universe. Indeed, a recent Scientific American article aroused a response from some of the world's most revered cosmologists that demonstrates just how slow and difficult is real change in the culture of science. The article in question, entitled "Cosmic Inflation Theory Faces Challenges," proposed that the universe began with a so-called Big Bounce instead of a Big Bang. The authors question cosmologists' interpretations of measurements of the so-called cosmic microwave background. Specifically, they disagree with the interpretation that data first published in 2013 proves that an extremely fast inflation occurred after a Big Bang 13.7 billion years ago. They state, if anything, the Planck data disfavored the simplest inflation models and exacerbated long-standing foundational problems with the theory, providing new reasons to consider competing ideas about the origin and evolution of the universe. Yet even now, the cosmology community has not taken a cold, honest look at the Big Bang inflationary theory, or paid significant attention to critics who question whether inflation happened. In a response letter to the controversial article, 33 scientists, including physicist Stephen Hawking, begin with a statement: "There is no disputing the fact that inflation has become the dominant paradigm in cosmology." They then accuse the authors of, quote, dismissing the research of not only all the authors of this letter, but also that of a substantial contingent of the scientific community. However, the problems for Big Bang cosmology reach far beyond anything that Hawking and his colleagues seem ready to acknowledge. On the question of the so-called cosmic microwave background, or CMB, the conclusion that the radiation is a, quote, background at all begins with the assumption of a Big Bang. But as previously discussed on this series, ample evidence exists to consider that the, quote, asymmetric radiation is in fact a locally produced foreground. As physicist Wal Thornhill has explained, proponents of the electric universe and plasma cosmology argue that the radiation is due to microwave radiation from the filamentary galactic electric currents flowing in the neighborhood of the Sun. In fact, some of the expected structures, a galaxy-wide sample of dense filamentary structures correlated with spiral arms and star formation, have been recently mapped. The image on your screen is an example of a network of galactic filaments. As Thornhill notes, we see a roughly orthogonal branching of tributaries, which is characteristic of an electrical discharge. This principle is seen in this comparison with experimental discharge filaments. If the CMB is in fact what physicist Eric Lerner has described as a, quote, radio fog of dense plasma filaments, its presence tells us nothing about the age of the universe. The local origins of the radiation would also help explain the seemingly baffling discovery of apparently vast and remote cosmic voids. The appearance of a cold spot, where the, quote, temperature of an area of space is interpreted as significantly lower than the surrounding region, suggests the presence of a void where many galaxies should be observed. The interpretation of the size of the so-called void is based on the assumption that the redshift of the surrounding galaxies provides an accurate measure of the object's size and distance. In recent years, some scientists have offered the incredible speculation that such a void is actually the imprint of a parallel universe. In fact, the concept of parallel universes, or the multiverse, is a theory championed by the aforementioned Stephen Hawking, as well as Brian Greene, Michio Kaku, and the current host of the television show Cosmos, Neil deGrasse Tyson. Ironically, at the time that cosmologist Carl Sagan wrote his iconic book Cosmos, challenges to the very foundations of the Big Bang were still permitted. On the question of whether the Doppler interpretation of galactic redshift is a reliable indicator of an expanding universe, Sagan wrote, "There is nevertheless a nagging suspicion among some astronomers that all may not be right with the deduction from the redshift of galaxies via the Doppler effect that the universe is expanding. The astronomer Halton Arp has found enigmatic and disturbing cases where a galaxy and a quasar, or a pair of galaxies that are in apparent physical association, have very different redshifts." Sagan continues, "If Arp is right, the exotic mechanisms proposed to explain the energy source of distant quasars, supernova chain reactions, supermassive black holes and the like, would prove unnecessary. Quasars need not then be very distant, but some other exotic mechanism will be required to explain the redshift. In either case, something very strange is going on in the depths of space." At the other end of the spectrum from so-called vast cosmic voids are objects that appear impossibly huge. One such object, the quasar cluster Huge LQG, is supposedly so enormous it would comprise about 5% of the visible universe. As one astronomer said of the discovery, it, quote, upsets the foundation of everything we do. The force of gravity is weak and takes time to move things around. The elapsed time since the conjectured Big Bang sets a limit on how big any structure can be. Structures exceeding that limit are, by the cosmologist's own admission, impossible. One possible solution to this enigma is that the objects simply are not as distant and huge as they appear, based on their measured redshift. Halt and Arp proposed that the redshift of quasars depends not only on a velocity value, but also its, quote, intrinsic redshift. This would be a property of matter that is subject to change over time. Arp found that the intrinsic redshift of a quasar or galaxy took discrete values, which decreased with distance from a central active galaxy. In Arp's hypothesis, many mature galaxies of a specific type eject newborn objects, called QSOs or quasars, and these objects grow up to be companion galaxies of their parents. As they move away from the parent, their mass and brilliance changes, their velocity slows, and they tend to begin to fall back toward the parent galaxy. Proponents of the electric universe, including physicist and chief science advisor to the Thunderbolts project, Wal Thornhill, agree with Arp's thesis of quasar ejection. However, Thornhill disagrees with Arp's description of the mass of quasars increasing with time. Arp proposed that the existence of a new quasar becomes recognized by matter in the rest of the universe at the speed of light. But in Thornhill's view, an initially positively charged quasar is followed by a beam of electrons from its parent galaxy, which would explain both the quantized redshift and increase in mass. These electrons may come in bursts, like the quasar ejections themselves, which if true would predict and explain seemingly impossibly sudden changes in quasars. As we reported last year on this series, many recently discovered objects in space lend great credence to this thesis. A team of astronomers using the Sloan Digital Sky Survey observed quasars behaving in a manner that completely upends conventional theory. Using images from the Pan-STARRS survey, the scientists identified 1,000 objects that appeared to vary in brightness over a period of just 10 years. Among these objects were a total of 5 galaxies that the team witnessed shape-shifting into quasars in a seemingly impossibly short period of time. The team also recorded a total of 12 quasars, quote, shutting down in a period of hundreds of days, rather than the hundreds of thousands of years required by standard theory. As reported by NewScientist.com, astronomers expect quasars to use up their fuel and settle down into quiet galaxies, a process that should take hundreds of thousands of years. So last year, when 12 quasars were spotted shutting down in just hundreds of days, it was a shock. In subsequent decades, as demonstrated by the recent protests of Hawking and company, little has changed in the culture of science.
How many times
the seemingly
does it have
endless
to be
cosmic
falsified
surprises have yet to force any real
you know what I mean?
reassessment of the cherished 13.5 billion year, quote, history of the universe. Institutional science remains unready to confront the possibility that based on our current limited knowledge, we must accept a universe of unknown age and extent. So the surprises for cosmologists will only continue, since nature seems to have no regard for human beliefs. For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info.
At Village Care Max, we're not just manage long-term care. We uplift people.
I've seen members who've had
Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. The following presentation is an adaptation of the Stephen Smith Picture of the Day article, Straighten Up. The link to the article may be found in the description box of this video. Conventional cosmological theories state that a black hole forms when a star with a mass about 5 times that of the Sun reaches the stage in its evolution where its thermonuclear fuel is used up. Since stars are thought to be internally powered fusion reactors, it is the outward push of radiation from inside a star that prevents its collapse under the force of its own gravity. As the standard model of stellar evolution speculates, a star accumulates heavier atomic nuclei in its core, making it impossible to keep its outer surface away with radiative pressure. Gravity overcomes fusion, so the star's gaseous envelope suddenly collapses, rebounding off the core in what astronomers call a, quote, supernova explosion. Since its gravity is no longer hindered by the radiating core, the star is said to shrink under that force, disappearing from normal space, compressing into a mass with no geometry. A ghost of the star's presence remains as an irresistible gravitational source. That concept drives all ideas about galactic scale behavior, since it is assumed that 98% of all galaxies are inhabited by so-called supermassive black holes. Among electric universe advocates, black holes are a questionable quantity. Despite claims to the contrary, no black hole has ever been observed. What is observed are effects that can be attributed to something other than ultra-dense matter, and that is electricity. According to a recent press release, quote, supermassive black holes in a region of the distant universe are all spinning out radio jets in the same direction. As Professor Ramil Dave from the University of the Western Cape wrote, this is not obviously expected based on our current understanding of cosmology. It's a bizarre finding. Most astrophysicists try to explain narrowly confined jets by invoking words like nozzle or high pressure, contrary to the behavior of gases in a vacuum. Some acknowledge that magnetic fields might focus gases into narrow beams, although there is a commonly held opinion that magnetic fields are not important. However, magnetic fields are only one part of the story. Failing to realize that electric currents create electromagnetic fields has led many physicists to model plasma in space without considering electricity. In an electric universe, gravity gives way to the effects of plasma. The stars are not hot, dense balls of hydrogen. Rather, they are plasma, with fusion taking place on their surfaces and not in their cores. The electric universe definition of plasma is not the conventional one of, quote, ionized gas. Plasma is a state of matter. Properties such as filamentation, long-range attraction, and short-range repulsion, braiding, formation and decay of plasmoids, and other phenomena contribute to the plasma condition. Everything in the universe is ionized to some degree. Therefore, it is plasma. Positive ions and negative electrons move through plasma in ways not governed by gravity. Although gravity might cause some heavy positive ions to create a charge surplus in one volume of space over another. When that happens, a weak electric field develops. An electric field initiates electric currents that generate electromagnetic fields. Those fields interact with other fields generated by other currents. In images from space, as well as in high-speed photographs of plasma activity in the laboratory, those currents form twisted pairs of filaments called Birkeland currents. Birkeland currents follow magnetic fields and draw charged material from their surroundings. Electromagnetism, quote, pinches the dust and plasma into heated blobs of matter called plasmoids. As the electric field intensifies, it increases the pinch effect, forming spinning electrical discharges. At first, they glow dimly red, then blaze yellow, and finally they might become brilliant ultraviolet arcs, called stars, driven by the electric currents that created them. Cosmic filaments have structure. Each is composed of smaller filaments that scale to an unknown extent. It has been demonstrated that plasma phenomena can scale to 14 orders of magnitude. Nobel laureate Hannes Alfvén hypothesized that the scale can go to 28 orders of magnitude or more. Stars are nodes in electric circuits. Electromagnetic energy could be stored in the equatorial current sheets surrounding them until some trigger event causes them to switch into a polar discharge. The electric jet could receive its energy from a natural particle accelerator, a quote, plasma double layer with a strong electric field. Toroidal magnetic fields form because of the polar plasma discharge, confining it into a narrow channel. Only electric fields can accelerate charged particles across interstellar space. Since Birkeland currents are filamentary, and since stars and galaxies occur in strings, the alignment of galactic jets observed by radio astronomers is not due to a, quote, coherent spin in the structure of this volume of space. It is due to the collimated nature of those electric currents. For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info. Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. New scientific reports suggest that ancient stone carvings confirm that a great comet struck the Earth over 10,000 years ago. Researchers at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland have studied the perplexing symbols carved on stone pillars at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. They have concluded that the markings in effect document a bombardment of comet fragments that hit Earth around 11,000 BC. Lead investigator Dr. Martin Sweatman says of the research, "It appears Göbekli Tepe was, among other things, an observatory for monitoring the night sky. One of its pillars seems to have served as a memorial to this devastating event, probably the worst day in history since the end of the Ice Age." He continues, "I think this research, along with the recent finding of a widespread platinum anomaly across the North American continent, virtually seals the case in favor of a comet impact. Our work serves to reinforce that physical evidence. What is happening here is the process of paradigm change." But if ancient stone carvings count as evidence of actual events, a far more sweeping paradigm change may be necessary. For nearly half a century, the founder of the Thunderbolts Project, David Talbot, has identified countless global patterns in ancient myth, symbols, and storytelling, which, under strict forensic guidelines, allow a reconstruction of extraordinary events. Talbot offered an introduction to his work in the feature-length documentary film, Symbols of an Alien Sky. In his ongoing video series, Discourses on an Alien Sky, he offers more detailed analysis of specific mythical themes, none of which can be understood in terms of anything observed in the sky today. We asked David Talbot for his summary of this latest claim of an ancient comet impact.
One thing's pretty clear. The global headlines were calculated to draw attention. From the British publication New Scientist, we read, "Ancient carvings show comet hit Earth and triggered many ice age." Or another popular media headline, "End of the world, ancient Göbekli Tepe vulture stone." And also this, "Ancient observatory may hold secret to comet collision and sudden climate change." Climate change even, with possible shifts in Earth's rotational axis. But no such thing is actually documented in any version of the story. The explosion of headlines around the world was ignited by a random speculation in reference to archaeological findings in Turkey going back to the 1960s. One headline after another looking for a story. And yet there is a story reaching far beyond this meager report. The real story has occurred across decades as scholars have begun to notice carvings on stone, raising the possibility that certain common themes might have been provoked by unusual celestial events. Think, for example, of the original work of plasma scientist Tony Peratt, showing profound similarities between rock art carvings of the so-called stick man and also the ladder of heaven, concretely identifiable as electric discharge configurations in the laboratory. That was real science, and it helped to animate the Electric Universe community more than 15 years ago. From the recent headline-grabbing announcement, you would not even know that there are recurrent themes in rock art, or that these themes find counterparts in early human storytelling and in sacred practices the world over. This cross-cultural accord requires systematic investigation, and without that, you're left with nothing but a wild guess. Why should anyone believe that the obscure picture shown here depicts either a comet or a swarm of comets? The carving itself gives no reason to believe such a thing. And yet it is significant that today's scholars appear increasingly willing to consider a celestial referent. What they need to consider is the vast field of evidence and a vantage point that works, and provably works. My own conclusion from years of research touching directly on this field is uncompromising. Isolated artwork and storytelling never provide sufficient content for a reliable reconstruction. Reliable conclusions are possible only when one takes into account the worldwide patterns, and that requires systematic attention to a broad field of evidence. The patterns to be explored include storytelling, artistic representations, and ancient reenactments of earth-altering events. Nothing less than a global, cross-cultural investigation could lead to any reliable conclusions. The greatest surprise for me was that there are far more global patterns than I'd even imagined possible. Hundreds of archetypes, all vitally connected to each other, and you won't find anything more compelling than that provable fact. Without a referent at the fundamental level of cross-cultural archetypes, no explanation could advance beyond a mere conjecture. Nevertheless, it is encouraging to see a general interest in unusual possibilities, something potentially profound in the ancient sky, something not occurring today. That does make good sense, and could be the beginning of real advances in the study of the ancient cultures and of planetary history as well.
For continuous updates on space news from the Electric Universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info.
It's AARP. Let me just...
Wait, are you joining AARP?
Actually, I just did.
Really? I didn't think we were ready for AARP. Is it worth it?
Well, just today, I saved on concert tickets, read a great article on investing, found a sweet travel deal, used the caregiver finder for my dad, and done. Discounted movie tickets.
If you don't think instant benefits when you think AARP, then you don't know ARP. For just $16 a year, you get discounts, so many ways to save. Instant resources, and just the right offers find you at just the right time. Plus, as a member, your voice will be heard. Join today for just $16. It's not too soon.
Call 1-888-463-0026.
And join AARP for just $16 a year. You'll also get this travel bag free when you join.
Call 1-888-463-0026. That's 1-888-463-0026.
Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. New scientific reports may provide insights into catastrophic events that once occurred on the planet Mars. Scientists at an observatory in Northern Ireland have conducted analysis of 9 asteroids that orbit Mars, called Trojans, and they've come to the conclusion that the asteroids are the remains of a former planet. The team discovered that the so-called Trojans appear to be composed of the same material, including the mineral olivine, which only forms at extremely high temperatures and is thought to be associated with planetary collisions. The team has concluded that the asteroids orbiting Mars are pieces of a former mini-planet, or planetesimal, which was destroyed eons ago by collisions. Those who have followed the Thunderbolts project may understand why neither mechanical collisions nor a hypothetical former planet are necessary to explain the asteroid's formation. For decades, the chief principals of the Thunderbolts project, Dave Talbot and Wal Thornhill, have proposed a very different history for Mars and all of the planets in the inner solar system. In ancient myth, Mars was identified as both the warrior hero and as his own weapon, the cosmic thunderbolt. Thornhill and Talbot state that Mars was devastated by electrical discharges in an epoch of planetary instability in the relatively recent past, perhaps several thousand years ago in prehistory. As, quote, radical as the theory may seem, it explains and in fact continues to successfully predict countless discoveries that only prove puzzling to planetary scientists. More than 6 miles of crustal depth was mysteriously removed from the Martian northern hemisphere. Consider also the many millions of cubic kilometers excavated from Mars in the formation of the stupendous feature known as Valles Marineris. Material from Mars still occasionally strikes the Earth in the form of mysterious meteorites. Indeed, the discovery of Martian meteorites was treated with great initial skepticism, since astronomers could not envision the escaped material reaching the necessary velocities to bring the material to Earth. If electrical discharges did in fact devastate the red planet from pole to pole, both the so-called Trojan asteroids and the presence of the mineral olivine are to be expected. No collisions with former planets are necessary. The mineral olivine presented a puzzle when it was discovered completely unexpectedly on a comet. Such was the case with the Stardust Next mission to the comet Wild 2 in 2004. NASA investigators were amazed to discover olivine and other minerals that only form at super-hot temperatures in dust samples from a so-called dirty snowball. As NASA curator Michael Zelensky said at the time, "That's a big surprise. People thought comets would just be cold stuff that formed out where things are very cold. It was kind of a shock to not just find one, but several of these, which implies they are pretty common in the comet." In fact, in the electric universe hypothesis, comets, asteroids, and meteoroids did not accrete billions of years ago in the solar system's infancy, but they were in fact torn from planetary surfaces by electrical discharges. NASA scientists were also amazed to discover the mineral tridymite on Mars, which only forms at extremely high temperatures and is thought to result from a kind of volcanism never suspected on Mars. As NASA geochemist Richard Morris said of the discovery, "It's really nifty, but we were shocked. There's no evidence for plate tectonics on Mars. That's why it's such a surprise to find this tridymite." However, as noted in a recent Space News report, tridymite has been reported to form as a product of lightning in a roofing slate, as documented in the book The Data of Geochemistry. In the feature-length documentary film The Lightning-Scarred Planet Mars, detailed analysis is given of countless geological features on Mars that find ideal analogs in laboratory experiments with electrical discharges. One such example is the towering Olympus Mons, a nearly 22-kilometer high so-called shield volcano, and the tallest mountain of any planet in the solar system. As noted in the film, the shield volcano interpretation of Olympus Mons presents far more enigmas than answers. The defining feature of a shield volcano is a gentle extrusion of fluid or low-viscosity lava. Shield volcanoes on Earth do not present a scarp, whereas the scarp of Olympus Mons towers at nearly 4 miles high. A NASA report freely acknowledges the scarp is of unknown origin. The steep cliff around Olympus Mons is peculiar and not characteristic of terrestrial shield volcanoes. But perhaps most striking of all may be the blanket of incredibly fine, filamentary ridges and ravines within the terrain of Olympus Mons. In fact, the continuing discovery of perplexing dendritic patterns on Mars is a key prediction of the electrical scarring hypothesis. New images taken by NASA's Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter reveal precisely the kinds of features expected from electrical discharges. Consider this recently released image of the terrain within the 10-kilometer Zunil crater on Mars. Scientists insist that the crater was produced by an impact, but they have no real explanation for the raised dendritic features associated with secondary craters within the crater. NASA's description of the image reads as follows. Secondary craters form from rocks ejected at high speed from the primary crater, which then impact the ground at sufficiently high speed to make up huge numbers of much smaller craters over a large region. In this scene, however, the secondary crater ejecta has an unusual raised relief appearance, like bas-relief sculpture. The best guess that NASA can offer is that the so-called impact crater has been mysteriously weathered over eons of time. The agency states, one idea is that the region was covered with a layer of fine-grained materials like dust or pyroclastics about 1 to 2 meters thick when the Zunil impact occurred about 1 million years ago, and the ejecta served to harden or otherwise protect the fine-grained layer from later erosion by the wind. But experimental research within the electric universe community provides far more promising possibilities. One such experiment, conducted by Billy Elverton, produced raised dendritic ridges simply by applying intense vibrations to soil. Consider also this experiment performed by YouTube user DiveFlyFish, subjecting aluminum foil to electrical discharge. Indeed, we have called the Martian environment a, quote, laboratory in space, ideal for testing the concepts of electric universe geology. It was well over a decade ago that physicist Dr. C.J. Ransom of VimaSat Laboratories was able to reproduce the mysterious so-called Martian blueberries by blasting quantities of hematite with an electric arc, only one of many such pathways of investigation, as repeatedly outlined on this series, as well as many dozens of picture-of-the-day articles on thunderbolts.info. Electrical discharges produce effects that could account for much of the consistently bizarre Martian geology. Space discovery today routinely provides surprising discoveries about the Martian environment. As human exploration brings Mars into ever finer focus, we confidently predict that the evidence will continue to mount for catastrophic events that left their indelible imprint on the red planet. For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info. Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. Comet science may stand at the precipice of revolutionary change. For well over half a century, consensus scientific theory has proposed that comets are icy bodies that formed billions of years ago in the solar system's infancy. Comet activity, including the production of filamentary jets and a cometary coma, is said to result from the sublimation of ices as a comet's orbit brings it closer to the Sun. However, for many years, scientific discovery has done nothing to increase confidence in standard comet theory. Close-up images of comet nuclei have revealed desiccated terrains, with nothing like the expected abundance of surface ice, and the hypothesized subsurface comet ice remains conjecture. Scientists have never found the theoretical vents or nozzles from which comet jets are thought to emanate, just one of many puzzles that demand new pathways of investigation. Electrical theories of comets may provide such pathways. Many of the most surprising comet discoveries were either predicted or become explicable by electrical interpretations, including the discovery of fast-moving electrons and electric fields close to the nucleus of Comet 67P. The detection of the signature of water molecules in cometary comas has long been thought to confirm the existence of abundant subsurface comet ice. But is there a better explanation? For several years, Thunderbolt's colleague Dr. Franklin Anariba has developed concepts of electrochemical reactions on comets, which may be the cause of much comet activity, including the production of the detected comet water. Recently, scientists studying data on the Lovejoy comet C2014 Q2 have reported findings that may affirm many of the principles Dr. Anariba has proposed. Today, Dr. Anariba offers a detailed analysis of these findings and explains the electrochemical processes that may happen on comets.
Let us put things in perspective. After the completion of the Rosetta probe journey around the Comet 67P, the origin of water observed in the coma is not clear, especially since the surface of the comet has been determined to be dark and dry. However, there are other possibilities for the origin of such water. Let us discuss one possibility. In a recent paper by Pagini et al. Titled Ground-Based Detection of Deuterated Water in Comet C/2014 Q2, also known as Lovejoy, at infrared wavelengths, published in the Astrophysical Journal Letters, Comet Lovejoy is studied via infrared spectroscopy at an Earth-based observatory using infrared emission lines for water, H2O, and heavy water, HDO, where D refers to deuterium, which contains one proton, two neutrons, one electron, unlike hydrogen, which contains one of each. The study used a near-infrared spectrometer located at the Keck Observatory during post-perihelion. The results suggest a water production rate of 5.9 times 10 to the 29 molecules per second, or about 17,641,196 liters per second, and a heavy water production rate of 3.6 times 10 to the 26 molecules per second, or about 11,255 liters per second. From these production rates, the DH ratio in Comet Lovejoy's water is extracted to be 3.02 times 10 to the minus 4, or more meaningfully, about 1.94 versus the DNS standard mean ocean DH ratio, which is taken as the benchmark and refers to the DH ratio in the ocean on Earth. It is important to highlight in this report that the DH ratio was methodically obtained by avoiding unnecessary systematic variables such as measurements on different days, different telescopes, as well as observations of water and heavy water separately. Subsequently, this DH ratio is compared against measurements carried out pre-perihelion via radio wave means, which display a ratio of only 0.89 versus the DNS standard mean ocean water. In other words, the DH ratio increases by a factor of 2.2 pre to post-perihelion. This is of significance. In the manuscript titled 67P Churyumov-Gerasimenko, a Jupiter family comet with a high DH ratio by Altwald et al., published in Science, a DH ratio value of 5.3 times 10 to the minus 4 is reported, which is not consistent with previous Jupiter family of comets, JFC data, strongly suggesting that the DH ratio of the Jupiter family of comets is highly heterogeneous. The cause of this high DH ratio is usually attributed to deuterium-enriched water ice in the protosolar nebula. Since this solar system formation is speculative, I will not elaborate on such explanation. However, a recent article by Yao and Yapis titled Dynamic Deuterium Enrichment in Cometary Water via Elie-Rideal Reactions, a different pathway for deuterium enrichment is proposed, namely the collision of cold with 10 to 15 electron volts and hyperthermal with 10 to 200 electron volts water ions against deuterium-enriched surfaces. The authors state water ions in the extended coma are accelerated toward the nucleus, where they collide with the outer nucleus crust of 67P, where the crust is dehydrated and includes typical cometary minerals such as olivine and pyroxene silicates and carbonaceous refractory minerals. Likewise, cold water ions moving away from the nucleus will collide with those particles in the extended coma, which have a chemical composition similar to that of the nucleus crust. The authors were able to demonstrate in the laboratory that silicon oxide and highly ordered graphitic carbon absorbs deuterium atoms via the bombardment of heavy water ions, D2O+, for 30 minutes at 200 electron volts, resulting in the formation of H2DO+ cations. This chemical pathway proposed can reasonably be called water ion implantation on the surface of the nucleus, and it is based on observational facts, especially the reported presence of hyperthermal water ions in the vicinity of comet 67P, although less certain on the nature of deuterated surfaces on comets. The key concept is that electric fields lead the way